the brain infrastructure, 87 billion neurons, billions and trillions of connections. This is the infrastructure that you're creating after the age of 21. Cognitive capacity is the connectivity of the neurons. The infrastructure, imagine a building, a huge building, that's held up by billions of pillars. So if a few of them are knocked down, nobody sees any difference from outside.
Which means cognition hasn't necessarily changed in a way that would be observable.
Observable. The building is functioning, nobody sees any difference, but the pillars are being knocked down one at a time in your 20s. I want this to be emphasized because it's very difficult for us to emphasize brain health to younger people. And those pillars are foundational. We're knocking them down or building them in our 20s. So everything you eat, your exercise, everything determines those pillars. So the pillars are knocked down, and then in your 60s, now there are enough pillars knocked down where you start seeing the wavering.
Welcome back to another episode of The Proof. I'm Simon Hill, your show host. Today I have the distinct privilege of hosting the extraordinary duo, Drs. Dean and Ayesha Sherzai, also known as the Brain Docs. Dr. Ayesha Sherzai is a distinguished vascular neurologist and research scientist. Dr. Dean Sherzai is a behavioural neurologist and neuroscientist. Together they've authored their two books, The Alzheimer's Solution and The 30-Day Alzheimer's Solution. In this conversation, we build on previous episodes, delving into the complex world of neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's dementia. We explore the scientific community's current understanding of the causes behind Alzheimer's dementia, and of course, the recent amyloid plaque controversy. We also discuss other neurodegenerative diseases, such as Parkinson's, Huntington's, ALS and MND, and multiple sclerosis. Along the way, we unravel several lifestyle tips to help promote long-term brain health and dispel common myths surrounding gluten, olive oil, red meat, omega-3s, choline, and more. My hope is that this 3-hour episode will leave you armed with a plethora of vital information to help you take better control of your health. Before we dive into this exchange, I'd like to kindly request that you subscribe to our channel on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or whichever platform you're tuning in from. And if you enjoy the show, please leave a review. Your support is not only deeply appreciated, but also essential in expanding the reach of this show. And now, my conversation with Drs. Dean and Ayesha Sherzai. Dean, Ayesha, it's been a minute. It's great to be doing this again. I think last time we caught up, if my memory serves me correct, was Little Pine, where we had dinner.
Yes. That's right.
With Adam and his partner and brother. And then we seem to always meet over food. We ate... I think a little bit before that, we also went to Cafe Gratitude with your kids.
We did, yes. Yeah. That was a couple of years ago, right?
Yeah, that was... Little Pine was 2021.
It was 2021, yeah.
So maybe 18 months ago.
Exactly.
Right, but it's nice to be back in your presence.
Always wonderful to see you. Thank you for having us.
I thought we could maybe start this conversation with something a little different. A bit of a true or false, almost like a rapid fire type segment. And you can add some nuance or context if you wish, maybe a couple minutes for each one maximum, and then we can put a pin in anything that we want to come back to.
Of course.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Let's do it.
Okay, you're in the hot seat now.
Okay.
Okay, so the first one, Ayesha, actually, and I wanted to check, is that the best way to pronounce your name?
Yes, perfect.
Ayesha is the better cook, but Dean, he does have a few recipes up his sleeve.
Yes, where they're accidental. Where we were making pizza and my spreading technique wasn't working out, so I created a stromboli, just folded it and said it's stromboli. And the kid said, "Oh my gosh, this is the best thing we've eaten." I didn't tell him it was a mistake. So whenever I'm making mistakes, that's my recipe.
I do similar. I turn a lot of things into a scramble.
That's right. I'm a master of scramble. I'm just mix things up. Yes. Okay. But she's amazing. I mean, I know she's
Very
my wife, but amazing cook.
What's your favorite thing, Ayesha, to cook at the moment?
That's a difficult thing to highlight. I mean, I love the idea of coming up with recipes. I don't really stay on track with recipes and books. The way I learned how to cook. I mean, I went to cooking school, but I learned how to cook from my mom. And she was always a touchy-feely kind of a person where she experimented with different ingredients, and we'd lived in different countries. So she would make variations of different cultural foods. And so currently, I think we're experimenting more with adding more different ingredients together and chopping them. So chopped salads and wraps and, soups that have a lot of different kind of vegetables and legumes and whole grains together. So quick and easy ones are my favorite.
Keep the microbiome happy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we're gonna chop and change between some fun ones, some personal ones, and some science. Science is fun too, of course. Amyloid plaque is the primary cause of Alzheimer's. It's ground zero. True or false?
False. Amyloid plaque is a downstream product. In about 5%, it is the primary cause. That's the APP, which is, and then the presenilin 1 and presenilin 2 variants. People who have these genes, they're going to get Alzheimer's early, before 65, and it's driven by amyloid. And we know the mechanism. It's the beta secretase and gamma secretase cutting the APP transmembrane protein in the wrong place. Then these proteins actually accumulate, and then they create these protein structures that become almost infectious. They propagate other protein structures. There's an infectious prion-like process. That's about 3 to 5%. But the rest is not so much driven by amyloid. Amyloid is a downstream product because we're not able to clear it in time. All this inflammation, all this oxidation, everything else adds to the process where we become overwhelmed. So that's the real answer.
That's what I want to come back to.
Yes.
I want to talk about the amyloid hypothesis and some of the controversy over the last year or so that I know you guys have covered extensively. So I'd really appreciate to get your perspective on that. I'm sure lots of people would love to hear from you on it. The next one is, and this was inspired partly by a book, but also partly by a lot of comments on social media. Whole grains and gluten are bad news when it comes to long-term brain health.
Oh, absolutely false. Actually, we have evidence to the contrary that whole grain consumption is associated with improved markers of cognition, which essentially are the vascular risk factors that we talk about all the time, improved cholesterol markers, improved glucose metabolism. As much as glucose is vilified, we know that when people consume whole grains, they actually do much better when it comes to the glucose metabolism, improved markers of blood pressure, vascular permeability, cerebral blood flow. And so it's unfortunate that they've been, considered as something that is harmful. It's not.
Where do you think that idea comes from? Is it an oversimplification of just saying carbohydrates are carbohydrates and not sort of delineating between different types?
I think that has to do a lot with it. I think the definitions are not clarified. And I think it has to do something with marketing as well. A lot of times foods that are highly refined carbohydrates are just given the general term of carbohydrates. When you think of carbohydrates, they think of bread and a one lump, a bigger category, not knowing that there's different variations of carbohydrates. We have our slow, complex starches, which come from fruits, vegetables, whole grains like quinoa, brown rice, the grains that are not gotten rid of their bran and their covering. And then you have the highly processed refined carbohydrates, and the spectrum goes on to like processed sugar, the table white sugar that we have. Obviously, we have enough evidence to show that when people stay, they consume more complex forms of carbohydrates, they do well as far as their metabolism is concerned. It's the simplified and the refined carbohydrates that are associated with damage to our vasculature.
I think that's such an important point because metabolic health at the moment is like clearly quite a buzzword, and everyone's focusing on metabolic health, and often there is this oversimplification I see where carbohydrates are just demonized across the board. But when you do look at that data, as you mentioned there, people that are eating more fruits, which do contain carbohydrates, more whole grains, have lower risk of type 2 diabetes, lower risk of obesity. So I'm glad that you kind of underlined that.
There's a psychology to all this as well. the psychology behind this, and we have to address that as a society, because it's the easy psychological path where people are looking for the one-off, the extraordinary, the superfood, the supervillain, the one thing that they can take off, the one thing that they can add. It's simplification psychologically as far as what I can do to really truly change my life. So if there's one villain, grains, or one, then it's much easier to circumscribe, define, and attack it and feel good about it, as opposed to a more complex approach, which is you have to take a lot of things together.
And what about the gluten piece? So not all whole grains contain gluten, but several of them do. Is there any data at all that suggests someone should be worried about gluten, celiac aside, anyone else should be worried about gluten from a brain health point of view?
So there's about anywhere between 1 to 3, some people say up to 5% people that have sensitivities. And that's a spectrum. Like a lot of other foods that have a spectrum of sensitivity, this is another one. And if you are sensitive to gluten, and that in itself should be addressed really systematically, because once you open that door, everybody that feels a little uncomfortable with a piece of food, they say, oh, I have sensitivity. So that should be tested out, because by inappropriate or inaccurate exclusion, you've just excluded entire food groups. That's an important thing, that you've basically excluded a very important food group for the rest of your life because you've just put a title on it. I'm sensitive to it. But if it's tested and you truly are sensitive, there are two things to do. One is you can desensitize. There's a process of desensitization. The other is, yes, if you can, exclude it. But I truly think that group can slowly incorporate it into their life, because the benefits outweigh the discomfort, the temporary discomfort.
As far as objective evidence is concerned, there's no shortage. We actually have a number of really good quality, long-term observational human studies that show that when people consume gluten, not only does it not have negative effects on cognition and brain, I'm just going to stick to the brain today, but it actually, people who avoid gluten may actually do more harm to themselves, because you may know, you know about this, and you've spoken about this in your previous podcasts. When you get rid of a food or a food product from your diet, what you replace it with, an isocaloric replacement of that food, matters a lot. And when people remove whole grains as a source of gluten from their diet, they replace it with most likely other things that could potentially be refined carbohydrates, or it could be sources of saturated fats and all the other things.
You start to kind of look for gluten-free labels.
Exactly.
Which we know has that health halo effect. Like if I was to personally, if I sort of think about this, if I was to remove gluten from my diet, let's say I have celiac, I would make sure that I'm removing the gluten-containing whole grains, but instead eating the gluten-free whole grains. And that would be the focus. And that's going to be best for brain health, cardiovascular health, etc. And Dean, your point, I think, was really pertinent, and it kind of builds on what Dr. B has mentioned many times on this show, is that often if you believe you're intolerant to gluten, firstly, it could be gluten, it could be wheat. There are some sort of wheat sensitivities.
Exactly.
And then there's also FODMAP sensitivities, and there are some studies where they've challenged people who thought they were intolerant to gluten, and they did some really interesting experiments and were able to tease out that in several cases it was actually FODMAPs, it wasn't gluten. And then, as you say, there are protocols to eliminate foods, which is a big trend right now, but then systematically try and rebuild it, bring the diversity back in so that you're eating a diet that you can tolerate but is also health promoting.
Absolutely.
Off air just before, you mentioned artificial intelligence. So this is the next true or false. Artificial intelligence is going to dramatically improve diagnosis and management of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and help us develop more effective therapeutic interventions.
100%. Artificial intelligence, aside from all the fear that we hear, which might be true and might not be true, to be honest, we're not completely sure of that. But as far as the positive side, is just absolutely immense. We are involved in this. We have a company that's working on artificial intelligence and brain. Our two kids were smarter than us. They both went into artificial intelligence and programming. And the data is there already. I mean, the ability of these machines to process faster, more intelligently, and algorithmically dive deeper into knowledge is just absolutely immense. I mean, whether you call it machine learning or otherwise, it's just absolutely immense. And it's going to grow exponentially in the next few years. We are so optimistic that I'm almost afraid to say what I think will happen in the next 10, 15 years, where more will be discovered with the help of these machines, these devices, these tools, these algorithms. In the next 10 to 15 years than all of humanity combined for the last million years. I mean, that's the way
You're
I
talking
look at it.
in general or specific to Alzheimer's?
Specific in general and specific to Alzheimer's and brain health and all of that combined. Our ability to understand the for example, and this might not have to do with artificial intelligence, but it's large data analysis and it's mathematical models. Our ability to process things like four-dimensional structure of protein, how protein is created, a particular protein, and how it folds and how it changes over time. That's the four. And we have done more in the last 5 years than in decades before that. And that's going to increase even more. And once we know all of the protein structure of humanity and how to manipulate it, then we know how to treat diseases. That's just the protein side, not even the genomics and how to do the CRISPR and the new CRISPR methodology and all that. So, and that's going to come with these incredible AI tools and large data structures that are going to open up everything. I'm just going to speak about the positive side because the negative side we really don't know. But the positive side is just immense, absolutely immense.
Okay. We'll come back. We'll put a pin in neurodegenerative disease and how much we currently know. I'd love to sort of understand maybe relative to cardiovascular disease where the current understanding is. And of course, it's an umbrella term, so I appreciate there's lots of different diseases and we might sort of step through a few of those. Hey friends, are you ready to take your fermented food game and gut health to the next level? Look no further than my digital guide, Plant-Based Ferments. Inside, you'll discover some of my favorite recipes, including my soy labneh and homemade kombucha. Visit theproof.com/ferments for more details. That's theproof.com/ferments. Okay, that's enough from me. Let's get back to the episode. Next one, true or false? This one's close to my heart. Melbourne was your favorite place you visited in Australia?
At the cost of making some friends and family members upset, I would say yes. It was. I love Melbourne. And one of the things that I love about Melbourne is that the city was designed around human beings. You know, when you go to a city, sometimes buildings are prioritized or certain structures are prioritized, but I feel like human beings were prioritized in Melbourne because they have beautiful parks, beautiful places for people to hang out and have conversations, amazing restaurants. I love the culture. I love the cosmopolitan, feel to it. I can live in Melbourne.
At the cost of potentially falling for the recency bias, I would say we were talking about Melbourne being one of our favorite cities, period.
Yes.
We came out from Barcelona. We loved it. Of course, Florence, we loved it. And these are old European cities, gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. But Melbourne had the modernity, human-centered, nature-centered, yet modern, and a modern touch as well. It's like they captured all transportation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
For two people that didn't know the city at all, we got around everywhere.
Yeah, we would just
everywhere.
Jump on the bus and the
tram,
train and go anywhere we wanted.
It was amazing.
And the people are so wonderful. Just everything is wonderful. We had such a great time.
I agree. So, and on the design of the city, I've lived in both Melbourne and in Sydney. And I can tell you, you're certainly right. When they designed Melbourne, they did think of people. It's a perfect grid. It's so easy to navigate. Whereas Sydney, and partly that's because there's a lot of water, but there's a lot of one-way roads. And so most people know if you're coming to Sydney from an interstate, you're going to get lost.
Oh,
Be
wow.
prepared to take some wrong turns.
Oh, wow.
We loved Sydney for a different reason.
Yes. Well,
we as soon as we landed, somebody in the hotel said, "Oh, are you guys here to see Sting?" I said, "Really, Sting?" I said, when? What? It said, tonight at this
At one of the stadiums. Close
stadiums,
to the
yeah.
hotel.
I said, oh my gosh, I'm going to go get tickets. He said, no, it's sold out. So I ran across, it was a mile away, got to the place, it was closed. I found the back door, went upstairs, found somebody, got tickets to the front row, and we saw Sting.
That's
Yeah, that
incredible.
Which was
epic.
absolutely epic. Absolutely epic. This is the most amazing 71-year-old I've ever seen in my life. Talk about healthy living.
It
Yes,
was amazing.
absolutely.
Incredible.
What's the key to getting those last minute tickets?
Begging. Begging and acting, and just begging well. Yes.
Yeah, and the accent probably helped as
Yeah.
well. You'd come a long way. Okay. True or false, olive oil can feature in a brain healthy diet.
True. And it has nothing to do with how I feel about it. It's not my opinion. You and I have talked about this in the past. When you look at the dietary patterns that have been associated with improved cognition, the Mediterranean diet, the MIND diet, olive oil was a part of it. Now, is it because of the replacement phenomenon that olive oil replaced sources of saturated fats like butter and margarine, or because of its innate quality of having high polyphenols and some other anti-inflammatory, antioxidant effects? We are now getting a little more information. There was a time when we didn't know, but now, because of very good studies and looking at particular aspect of olive oil in a diet and the polyphenols that come along with it, it seems that the polyunsaturated fats and the polyphenol do play a positive role in brain health. I know that this may not be very popular with some people, but I think we have enough data to say that yes, olive oil can be a part of a healthy dietary pattern.
Do you have any tips for kind of navigating the olive oil shelf? Something that I've been thinking about a little bit, and I'm not sure whether the research is there's enough resolution there to kind of determine, is extra virgin olive oil significantly better than regular olive oil? Is there benefit in choosing something that's higher in polyphenols? How would you kind of encourage someone to think about that if they're at the grocery store?
Yeah, I've been struggling with that too. There's not very clear evidence, and it's very difficult to know where our olive oil is coming from. Even though there's some, like stamps and markers on the bottle, it's difficult to know. But the quick and easy one would be to say, just look at the date of manufacture. You don't want it to be years before it was manufactured. You want to grab bottles that are darker because it gets oxidized when it's exposed to light. You want to make sure that when you store it, it's closed properly and it's in a dark place, completely closed, not exposed to oxygen. And it's much better to get extra virgin olive oil that is cold pressed and made where you live, rather than being imported from a different country, because the likelihood of this being fresher is higher when it's local. So for us, it would be California made extra virgin olive oil that is cold pressed, preferably in Southern California if we have that luxury. I know that the cost goes extremely high when you have to factor in all of these things, but those would be just the rough measures. Beyond that, I don't know of any good data to kind of differentiate between good and bad extra virgin olive oil.
And what about cooking temperature? There's lots of different ideas out there. I tend to use olive oil for almost all of my cooking, but is that the right approach, or is there a certain temperature you should try and stick to?
I've changed my mind. I've changed quite a bit in the past few years, just based on my reading. There was a time when it was suggested not to cook it at all because of, the high oxidative effect. But now with some data, we actually know that it might not be true, that extra virgin olive oil can be tolerated at higher temperatures. So, instead of just using it as a salad dressing, I'm actually starting to, saute some vegetables in it, or, spray it on some tofu to cook very quickly in an oven. But again, this is still evolving and I'm still learning, but I'm not really close-minded as far as not cooking with it at all or raising the temperature on it based on the newest data.
Okay. Next one is maybe controversial. Not really controversial, but it could be.
That's why we're here.
It could be in certain circles.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe we can create some controversy.
Sure.
Although the catchphrase for this show is facts, nuance, and trustworthy recommendations over hyperbole. So we would be going against that, but it might help with ratings. Red meat, being rich in vitamin B12 and iron and other micronutrients, is an important food for promoting optimal brain health.
No, but we'll give it a little nuance. For transparency, we're vegans, we're plant-based, for animals, for environment, but we want to make sure that we're science-based so people can trust us, whether it's with fish or meat. This monosyllabic approach, when it comes to health, of saying this completely negating another food group is the only possible way of being healthy is wrong. Can you be healthy with certain amount of meat and especially non-processed? Yes, absolutely. Is it the optimal? Not necessarily. But this absolutist approach is wrong. It's not scientific. I mean, we would hope that people don't eat meat for other reasons as well, and it's not the most beneficial form of food. But yes, it has B12. It has other substances as well. So it's definitely controversial in our communities, but it's the reality. Same thing with fish. The data on fish is that especially small fish, that it's helpful. We think that there's a lot missing in that data. There's a lot of nuance as far as toxins that accumulate that we don't measure. We only measure mercury and lead, and even they're inconsistently, but not thousands of other chemicals that bioconcentrate in these animals. But the data, the epidemiological data, shows that people who eat fish, especially smaller fish, they're healthier in certain ways, especially cognition. But so we have to have that nuance at the minimum for the sake of having data-driven conversations so that people can then trust each other across these silos that are being formed. Vegans, non-vegans, paleos, keto. And I think that's important. And the data kind of shows that as well.
I think, like, say someone who makes the claim that grass-fed beef is really important for brain health. I think if they were listening to this and they were going to push back, the thing that I often hear is they say, well, you're lumping grass-fed, finished, regenerative beef in the same basket as hot dogs and people that are eating hot dogs and hamburgers, processed meats in a white sort of bread, bun or roll, etc. So they would say it's unfair. You're not actually independently looking at the effect of unprocessed red meat. What would you kind of say to someone?
I agree with them.
Yeah,
I agree with them. You can't lump hot dogs with grass-fed beef. But the next sentence should be, is grass-fed beef that much healthier? Or is it the healthiest form of food to take in? I don't think so. I don't think it is the healthiest. It's healthier, yes, absolutely. And the degree of how much healthier is being exaggerated. There are biases people have. Just because they're eating grass-fed meat, it doesn't mean it's that much healthier. We're talking about the saturated fat levels change. We know that the hormonal and antibiotic elements change. A lot of other things change. But it's still not the healthiest food. So they're right that it's not fair to lump it all together, the same way that we talked about carbs being lumped in together. But the exaggeration of it being that much, being a health food, I think that's definitely hyperbole and exaggeration.
And it's important to look at patterns, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in nutrition, you know how important it is for us not to focus or hone in on a single food product and just look at patterns. Nutrition research is not perfect. It's messy. It's getting better. I'm very hopeful with large data analysis and machine learning to actually even make that process better, where we know, we understand the nuances, where we understand the complexity of somebody's genetics and their biology and how it interacts with food. That time will come, and it's in the near future. But until then, I think we should basically rely on what we've learned over the last 3, 4, 5 decades as far as nutritional patterns are concerned. And when it comes specifically to red meat, when you look at dietary patterns that have been associated with, say, for example, lower risk of stroke, lower risk of Alzheimer's disease, lower risk of Parkinson's disease, and other neurodegenerative conditions, meat was not a part of it. Meat was always considered as something that would be associated with poor cognition. Now, how that meat was consumed right? Or what type of meat we're talking about, because meat is not just meat. There are multiple different kinds of meats, right? That has been studied a little bit so far. For example, there was a paper that was published in the UK Biobank, and they looked at processed meat versus red meat or unprocessed meats and its effect on cognition. So when you look at those kind of nuances, you can actually tell better. Those kind of research papers that have studied specifically the type of meat and cognition outcome or dementia outcome, they always look at the end stage disease, which is dementia. In most of these studies, it seems like red meat is a replacement for something. When they compared in the UK Biobank study, when they compared processed meat with unprocessed meat, it seemed that processed meat increased the risk of dementia, but unprocessed meat didn't. It was actually associated with better outcomes. But when you look at the data closely, there is this problem of almost reverse causality, where people who are frail, who are at the stage where they actually may not have the resources to buy better quality meat, they stick to unprocessed meats. But then people who have a healthy bias, they have more money, socioeconomically they're in a better position, they go for red unprocessed meat. Was it the unprocessed meat? Potentially could have been so many other different things that resulted in better cognition as well. So those are some of the flaws in our research that doesn't really help us understand this better. But generally speaking, if we kind of step outside of the realm of brain health and dementia, red meat is associated with increased LDL, which is a risk factor for dementia. It is associated with uncontrolled blood pressure, which is a risk factor for dementia. And even beyond insulin resistance, and then even beyond central nervous system, increased risk of cancer, increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So I think it's flawed to say red meat is necessary for brain health and it's healthy. It's just that statement is wrong. We don't have any evidence for that.
I want to make sure we come back to insulin resistance when we're talking about the kind of etiology of Alzheimer's in a little bit and some of the different hypotheses that are out there. What if someone, to continue this kind of conversation, said, Dean, Ayesha, I hear what you're saying. And to preface this, I don't think this is a very strong argument, but it's something that could be put forward. How can a food like red meat that we evolved on eating that potentially is responsible for our brain rapidly developing, how can that be harmful for our brain over the long term?
So that's a great question, but every question should be broken down to its elements. So to bring in anthropology and history of human evolution into 21st century has flaws. First of all, what are you comparing? Longevity, dementia risk, heart disease risk between those people and us? That's not even comparable because majority, if not all of the people who lived even, let's say, 6,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, agriculture, as we know, it started 10 to 12,000 years ago, but really our survival length increased about 150 to 200 years ago. Dr. Snow, which found cholera in the wells in England, and that's how epidemiology started. That's how disease prevention started. So up to 200 years ago, we wouldn't be living past 50. Before that, 30 and 40 was the average. So to compare data coming from us from times where people didn't live past 30 or 40 to now has no meaning, especially when you're comparing the final outcome, which is mortality, which is past 30 now, which is dementia, which would never have happened because those diseases happen after 30, 40, 50, heart disease. So that comparison doesn't work. The other flaw with this is the assumptions that go into this, that because they lived a certain way, that therefore they were healthier. We don't have that data. First of all, we don't have the data that they actually consumed a lot of meat. The bone data and feces data doesn't corroborate that. There's evidence that there were more grazers than hunters. That was just a unnecessary name that was given to them. They were most of the time chasing berries more than bears.
That point is often lost on people, and I think what I've read is that there might have been an overestimation of the amount of calories from animal foods because bones are preserved, but the plant foods are not really preserved in these archaeological sites.
Exactly. So there's a lot of flaw in that kind of thinking, both as far as the comparisons, the disease comparisons, as far as what the data we have, as far as what they were doing, what they were eating. So I think that argument does not work in today's world.
Right. And I mean, just to kind of go back to one point there, you're not saying that they weren't consuming meat. Humans were consuming meat, but it's a very different question, or thinking about longevity is a very different question to thinking about survival.
Correct.
And the foods that help you survive may be completely different to the food or dietary pattern that's best for longevity. And today we find ourselves in an environment where we have a wider suite of food choices to make.
Correct. A surplus. Yeah.
Okay, true or false? And I know that you're well equipped to answer this one. Omega-3 fatty acids are the most important fat for the brain.
True. So far, to the best of our knowledge today, they are. And this comes from multiple different studies, studies that look at consumption of omega-3 fatty acids as food, and also omega-3 fatty acids as supplementation. Dean and I published a couple of papers a couple of years ago, looking at multiple different papers that have come out that look at omega-3 supplementation in two populations. The majority of the studies were done in children and in elderly populations to see whether supplementation improved cognitive outcomes. And they had different kind of neuropsychological testing endpoints for children versus elderly. The data wasn't very clear. We don't have very clear outcomes, but there was a trend. There was a trend towards improved cognitive outcomes, both in children and elderly, when they had enough omega-3 fatty acids in their dietary patterns and when they supplemented if they needed it. And when you look at the pathophysiology of, say, let's talk about the elderly population. As it happens, omega-3 fatty acids are necessary for maintaining the infrastructure of the neuron and the neuronal connections. As a matter of fact, 57% of our brain is made up of DHA, and it needs to be replaced on a regular basis. Our reservoir goes down significantly when we don't get enough of it. People always think that we need to eat fat. Brain is made out of fat, and we need to eat fat.
And cholesterol.
Yeah, and cholesterol. Yeah, it is made up of fat. When you look at the dry weight of the brain, it's about 50% fat. But the kind of fat matters. We don't need saturated fats. As a matter of fact, our brain doesn't have the capacity to internalize saturated fats or cholesterol. We do make enough cholesterol in the brain, in the neurons, that would serve its purpose. But the one kind of fat that we need on a regular basis is the long-chain fatty acids, omega-3.
And is there a kind of amount that you would recommend for people of different ages, or what? I know that you supplement in your life. How do you approach that? Again,
the data is not clean. The data is flawed by two factors. We only saw signal later in life and in early life. And it doesn't mean that in midlife it's not beneficial. It's just that in midlife, our ability to detect delta, our ability to detect change, as far as cognition is concerned, is not good, because there's an incredible amount of cognitive reserve, which means that our cognitive capacity is good enough that even if when there's vacillation, it's so minimal to not be able to be detected by the tools we have. That's a little complicated. But midlife, we probably are affected significantly by omega-3, but we don't have the tools to detect the change that well.
I want to put a pin on this comment, because I think this is one of the concepts that is not really discussed in all of the different conversations about brain health and health in general. Just because we don't see a signal during midlife about something, or if people feel fine, doesn't necessarily mean that we don't lay the foundation of disease during that period. Sorry, I just want to
it's beautiful.
Really highlight that.
Well, that's similar to cardiovascular disease.
Correct, but even more so for the brain. The brain infrastructure, 87 billion neurons, billions and trillions of connections. This is the infrastructure that you're creating after the age of 21. Before that, it's the cells, growth of cells. In fact, there's some programmed cell death around age 5 or so that you end up with less cells. But the connections are built thereafter. And much of the connections are related to your environment, how much you're challenged, a bunch of stuff. But also the demyelination continues all the way to early 20s. So now you have what they call brain capacity. But cognitive capacity, these are arbitrary terms that are created to describe certain things. Cognitive capacity is the connectivity of the neurons, the infrastructure. Imagine a building, a huge building, that's held up by billions of pillars. And so if a few of them are knocked down, nobody sees any difference from outside.
Which means cognition hasn't necessarily changed in a way that would be observable.
Observable. The building is functioning, nobody sees any difference, but the pillars are being knocked down one at a time in your 20s. I want this to be emphasized because it's very difficult for us to emphasize brain health to younger people. We're writing a third book, and a huge segment of it, actually more than a third, is around children and young adults and their brain capacity. And those pillars are foundational. We're knocking them down or building them in our 20s. So everything you eat, your exercise, everything determines those pillars. So the pillars are knocked down, and then in your 60s, now there are enough pillars knocked down where you start seeing the wavering.
So I think in that example, you mentioned a building, so pillars in a building, right? And so that building falling down is sort of synonymous with cognition impairment, right?
Correct.
Being observable. Now, you can take a peek into that building. You could do an inspection and notice, okay, some of these pillars have been knocked down.
Yes.
We might want to get on the front foot here before this thing falls down.
Yes.
And maybe that's something we'll come back to, because I know a lot of people will be interested in, okay, I'm 30, I'm 40. What can I measure? Are there biomarkers or tests or scans that I can do on my brain that will tell me, hey, you're on the road to Parkinson's, or you're on the road to Alzheimer's, dementia, or Huntington's, whatever it may be?
I think it's the most critical topic that we should be speaking about, because it's in our 30s that it's not just that we're avoiding disease, but we're actually building capacity.
Yes.
That's been our focus in the last few years. It's not just Alzheimer's, but younger people. How do you get the signals to the young people to show that, oh, look, you're losing some capacity here, or you're gaining capacity? That's something, because if you don't have those markers, people are not motivated. Motivation is a complex thing when your life is driven by other factors when you're younger. But that's when it starts, especially when it comes to your brain, and it's foundational. So now when we looked at the data with omega-3, one of the factors, just one of many, we didn't see any. Most of the papers came back negative because the population they had included were younger people. We didn't have the tools of detecting signal, but we know that it affects them as much, if not more. What we did see signal, and I'm going to get to the dosage, was later in life or even pre-dementia patients called MCI, or mild cognitive impairment patients, which have a much higher proclivity for dementia. And these populations, you did see an effect. Omega-3 did have an effect, DHA, and it was at higher doses. And the second flaw with a lot of studies were they never saw signal because the doses were lower. Dosage problem. And we were going to talk about other studies that with choline and other things where the dosage comes to us from many years ago accidentally, but nobody focused at dose studies. They were looking at effect studies. So in that population, the higher doses were the dose that saw signal, 1,000 milligrams, 1,500 milligrams. So it's not definitely not definitive as far as the dose, but we went on the higher dose as far as omega-3 is concerned.
One of the other things I've thought about those trials, but it goes across nutrition trials in general, is the importance of knowing someone's baseline levels of DHA or EPA that in the study, because you could give everyone 1 gram of DHA EPA, but the levels achieved at an individual level through that study are going to be vastly different. And so another approach would be to somehow personalize the dose for each participant to achieve a given DHA or omega-3 index, and then to say, okay, well, if you get to X percent, like 5-6% omega-3 index, whatever dose that is for you, personalized dose, then you're going to have lower risk. It'll be another way of looking at it.
Absolutely. I think we're learning more and more that not everybody achieves a particular level if they're given a particular dose. From the studies done in the ApoE4 allele populations. So say, for example, if someone has one copy of apolipoprotein 4, which has been associated with increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, they've seen that when they have ApoE4, they don't necessarily transport DHA as much as non-ApoE4 allelic participants do. So that nuance and that personalization depends on so many different factors. Are we there yet? No, we're not. We don't know. We don't have enough data to be able to prescribe and personalize a specific nutritional pattern or whatever needs that a person has for preventing Alzheimer's disease. And to tie this concept to the question that you asked before, like what should people do? Like you're a younger person and now you know a lot about brain health. Where do you start from? What kind of biomarkers are there? So the answer to that question is it has multiple tiers, right? So generally speaking, just the awareness that you have to take care of your lifestyle, what you eat, how you move, how you sleep, how you keep your mind active is very important. And that should be spread out as far as, in the form of a public health announcement is concerned. And then going deeper into more personalized and more detailed and more nuanced approaches to personalized medicine for brain health is concerned, there are some flaws in there. There are some companies and some physicians who are kind of taking this way too far and extrapolating way beyond the data and recommending things that are not really based well into science. But we have enough data as far as vascular risk markers are concerned. So for example, if you have blood pressure, high blood pressure, and that high blood pressure is, believe it or not, anything over 120 millimeters of mercury for systolic and anything above 80 millimeters of mercury diastolic. If your blood pressure is over 120 over 80, that's a problem.
Which is a lot of people.
Huge.
A lot of people.
I think the numbers are crazy. Even in the United States, I'll stick to our country. In the United States, people between the ages of 18 to 39, 25% of them have high blood pressure. Just think about that. They need to be on a medication, right? So those are easily modifiable things. I shouldn't say easily. For some people, it might actually be related to some underlying disorder that may need some treatment or something of that nature. So knowing your blood pressure, knowing your LDL cholesterol. We've talked about this in the past. High LDL has been correlated with cognitive impairment and cognitive decline during midlife as well as later on in life. Making sure that people understand what their hemoglobin A1C is, which is a marker of glucose metabolism, what their fasting glucose monitor is. That doesn't mean everybody should be wearing a continuous glucose monitor, but having an idea of what your glucose metabolism is, cholesterol is, blood pressure is, making sure that your vitamin B12 levels are checked, making sure that your vitamin D levels are checked. Those are some of the surface level, easily modifiable risk factors that are available now. And then when it comes to, say, for example, omega-3 fatty acid metabolism, knowing your ApoE4 status, and even going deeper down into things like, how does my body metabolize vitamin D? Do I have enough active vitamin D available for my brain to use it, to think better, to function better? Those are a little more, nuanced things that are available. But I always fear of, some of these companies taking advantage of people and selling them things that are not really based on science so far.
I think we maybe spoke about ApoE4 testing previously, and maybe you've changed your view, maybe you haven't. But I think at the time you thought, unless you really, really are curious, it might not be worth the money and the stress because there's not a lot of action you could take that would be different to someone who doesn't know their ApoE4 status. Has that changed? Like if say, for example, I tested and I had 1 copy or 2 copy of ApoE4, would that information help me make different decisions?
We have different opinions on this. I would say yes and no. Yes, because now we're realizing, as I mentioned earlier, that, say, for example, your need for omega-3 fatty acids, or your decision of adding fat or not adding fat to your diet, whether it's polyunsaturated fats or omega-3 fatty acids. I won't say saturated fats, because I think there's almost like, a direct relationship between saturated fats and poor brain health. But the need for adding fat and all those kind of small little decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis may change on our understanding of having 1 or 2 copies of ApoE4.
Oh boy, you started a big problem here in this family. Look what you did, Simon.
Right, so if someone's listening right now
Yeah.
who has 1 copy or 2
Right.
copies of ApoE4, and they are sort of trying to connect the dots here.
Right.
So my original question was how much omega-3 we should be taking. Am I right in that you're saying if you have a copy of ApoE4 or 2 copies of ApoE4, you actually may require more DHA and EPA to achieve the same level in the brain?
That's the trend and our understanding. That's the pattern. We had a conversation with Dr. Hussein Yassin, who runs the lab at USC, and that's his primary focus. And he's so amazing. I think he said more I don't knows in our conversations than anybody else I've heard, because he's a true scientist. But I think that is the trend. It seems that the reason why we haven't seen any results in previous research studies when people were given an omega-3 supplementation and it didn't work was not because it didn't work. It actually may not have worked because it probably was a low dose. A 250 milligrams of DHA supplementation did nothing. But now that there's another study coming up, and hopefully we'll have the results very soon, they've increased that dose to 1 gram, 2 gram, sometimes even 4 grams for people who carry 2 copies of ApoE4. So we'll know.
A lot of times we forget about the unsexy but incredibly important factors like blood pressure or LDL. When we did we lead one of the largest community-based projects in the country, the African American churches here, and when we did a fair, we gave one thing away to the community: blood pressure machines. Yeah. That's an easy, correctable, understandable thing that it's a biomarker. Talk about biomarker, a blunt biomarker that tells you so much more. And then the next thing was LDL. And so those are the important things to focus on. Now, the nuance of beyond that, for somebody that's motivated, it can have it's a two-edged sword. Because right now, yes, so the only thing we can do is maybe increase our omega-3. Even that's not fully clear. But my worry is that if you're going to spend all that money, all these companies are making money off of you of omega-3 levels and all these, and ApoE4 status. What happens is every time you forget something, you have nothing to do. You can't do anything about it. But it's going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy, kind of this anxiety, this worry, and it just accumulates because, and I've had patients, and I've seen thousands of patients, so, and I've seen people who have tested themselves, and in none of them have I seen the knowledge of ApoE4 being of benefit. In every one of them, it was a focus of anxiety. I tell people, assume you have risk, and we all do. If it's not ApoE4, it's something else. And just live healthfully. So at this point, but we will be around the corner in a few years, 5 years, where we will have personalized adaptations.
That's the blessing and the curse of working with human beings. When you're a physician, you have all of this knowledge, you have all of this conversation with people, and then you're able to look at statistical significance versus clinical significance. And that's one area that is not really talked about a lot. Just because we have a p-value of 0.001, less than 0.101, doesn't necessarily mean that a person goes from not driving, not being able to write a check, not being able to do their laundry, not being able to turn off the stove at night and lock their door, to someone who's completely fine and does all of these things, you know? So we as neurologists and as public health advocates, we want to make sure that people understand the difference between statistical significance and clinical significance. And a lot of the conversation that is going on in the background, they're not out there to that level where it makes a clinical significance.
Right. I can see to your point, someone attributing any forgetfulness or brain fog to the fact they have 1 or 2 copies of ApoE4, and then
Yes.
that being very anxiety provoking for a certain person, which I think is probably the majority of people. I can think of a few people I know who probably, if they tested and found out they had 2 copies, based on their mindset, it would just be really empowering, and they'd go all in on the lifestyle changes, and that would be something that convinces them to actually start being a bit more proactive with their health. And so I can see maybe there is someone who needs that push.
Yes.
But I definitely see the circumstance where it could be anxiety provoking. My question here on that, which is an interesting sort of sidestep, is what is a normal level of forgetfulness or brain fog for someone who's in their 30s or 40s that is baseline and is normal and shouldn't lead to people sort of freaking out?
What a great question. Because it's, at this point, I should say I don't know. As Ayesha said, a good scientist would say I don't know. But I'm going to delve in because we have a podcast to speak about.
We have to say something, right?
No, because otherwise I'll be sitting here saying I don't know. And that's a great scientist. But reality is it's a great question because if there's any change, and the change should be not be detected just by you, but by people that know you. If there's any change from a baseline, it's a point of worry. Now, that worry doesn't mean you have the beginnings of dementia. It could be that the anxiety level is bad, or your life is overwhelming, or focus is affected. I say that focus is the gatekeeper of consciousness, and focus is the first thing that affects your cognition, memory, and everything else. And the other part of this is if you fix focus, you open up a doorway to incredible cognitive capacity. Not fixed focus, but improved focus. So that's one.
I have to think that focus is taking a hit across the board with mobile phones and the algorithms that are just getting better and better to kind of draw us in.
No, that's why this makes this beautiful question. So if there's a delta, if there's a change from a baseline that you detected yourself or others detected or both, then it should be investigated. Because the first thing people do, and people come to me all the time for this, and I detect, there's depression. That's the most common. Anxiety, that's the second most common. Third is they're just overwhelmed. Fourth is medications, certain medications that affect their focus and things like that.
So depression itself as a condition will increase forgetfulness and brain fog?
Well, depression, when we talk about the different kind of dementias, there's a dementia, although it's less popularly used now, it's called pseudodementia. Not pseudo as in false, but it's not a degenerative dementia or a permanent dementia related to depression. People who have severe depression. Their depression is so bad that they can't do their daily activities. When you speak to them, I had one patient, the depression was so bad that they couldn't maintain alertness and focus to the end of the sentence. Not a single sentence could be finished because it would be interrupted by that depression, by anxiety, by loss of focus. That's the extreme. But imagine the whole spectrum. So any level of depression is going to affect your focus, your memory, things of that nature. Lack of sleep. Pain is another important one. So if somebody's having any change in their memory, they should figure out if it's related to any of those. And if it's not related to those, the next thing is metabolic stuff, thyroid. Very common. In fact, one of the things approved by insurance in the United States, one of the few things, it's B12 and thyroid as markers of cognitive decline. So check their thyroid. That could hypothyroidism is one of those. And then B12, low B12 levels is another one. So the answer, in short, although I went long, is if there's any change from baseline, investigate because it's a reversible thing usually. Okay.
And point being there is that it's not always a neurodegenerative process. It could be a bunch of things.
Correct. And treatable things. By the way, if they're treatable and you leave them like as the way they are, it can get worse to the point that it becomes a neurodegenerative process. For example, sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is obstruction of oxygenation during sleep because of blockage or central sleep apnea. So there are studies that show that as sleep apnea, untreated, can increase your risk of dementia significantly. Some studies say 70% and others, but it's significantly. So that's a treatable thing, either with weight loss, with surgery, or more commonly with these devices that can, and that's completely true. But if it's not treated, then it becomes first attention and focus, fatigue, mood disorders, even stroke and heart disease, but definitely cognitive decline and dementia.
Just to tie close the loop on omega-3s, I'm not sure if you saw this. I saw recently Dr. Klapper, who I listen to quite a bit. I find him to be quite engaging and a friendly, very friendly guy. He had been sort of quite vocal that he didn't recommend omega-3 supplementation for a while, and his sort of rationale for that was there was a small effect of increased risk of prostate cancer. Now, we could debate whether that's clinically meaningful and is that reason not to supplement. But I did find it interesting. He put up a video recently. I'm not sure if you saw it.
Yes.
He had stopped DHA supplementation himself. I really admired the fact that he put this video together because he's changed his view.
We love that.
Yeah.
That's a true scientist. We were in a conference with him, and he's a lovely human being. Probably one of the best human beings you can imagine. And the fact that he's open to data.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's the most important thing.
So for the listeners, he had stopped DHA supplementation. He was testing his omega-3 index. He saw it was falling. It went below 4%, and 4% is like the average level, might not even be the optimal. Japanese populations who have very low risk of cardiovascular disease and neurodegenerative disease are at about 8%. It is an association. And often that sort of between 6 and 8% is where people say you should try and target. And he got this low result, and I thought it was interesting. He ran another experiment where he increased his flaxseed and chia seed and all of these plant-based sources of omega-3s that contain ALA. And so the scientist in him was wanting to see, well, if I just eat more of that, will my body convert more of the ALA to the DHA and I can get this number back up? And unfortunately, it went down. It continued to go down, track down without that direct source of DHA for him and his biology. So he was kind of left with the decision of, does he want to take the risk with a really low omega-3 index and potentially increase his risk of neurodegenerative disease? And he decided to restart the supplementation.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We admire him for that, for his ability to change with data.
Definitely.
We had a conversation. He was at our home a couple of years ago. Yeah, speaking about this very topic, and we were pro omega-3, and so we're happy that he's doing that because we think it is that important. People should know that omega-3 is that critical for brain health.
And he said he was taking, so that listeners know, about 550 milligrams per day of DHA EPA. I take a little bit more. I think mine might be 850 milligrams, but not too far away. Quick one, folks. I get asked all the time about buying supplements and getting blood tests. The good news is I've created comprehensive and completely free guides for both. Simply head over to my website, theproof.com, to download them. That's theproof.com. Okay, let's get back to the episode. Okay, we're still on the true or false segment here. This is the last true or false, and you mentioned choline. So true or false, choline is an important micronutrient for brain health, and people eating plant-based diets do not consume enough choline.
So that's a very important question. I don't know if I should say true or false. I'm not going to actually choose an answer for this because we're still learning more about it. I think we had a conversation about this during our last conversation. The way choline was recommended as an important nutrient, the basis for why it was considered important is not stable enough for us to basically put a flag on it. Yes, it is important. It is important in the production of phosphatidylcholine, which plays a very important role in creating the infrastructure of the neurons and the nerves and its connections. But we don't have enough objective evidence to actually put choline in a recommended daily allowance categories. We don't actually have an RDA for choline, and we have adequate intake, then AI. And that comes from the fact that we don't have enough established evidence to show the level of choline recommended for human beings to have healthier brains. I'm going to stick to my field, which is neurology and neuroscience. The studies that have been conducted on choline and cognitive outcomes were essentially done in very, very sick people, where, for example, they had certain diseases that resulted in low choline intake. And when the choline was less than 50 milligrams, as far as their intake is concerned, they had health problems. They had cognitive problems. And then when it was replaced with very high doses of choline, I believe it was 500 milligrams. When it was replaced with 500 milligrams, they tended to reverse those problems, right? So my problem with that study is, first of all, it was done in a population that was very sick. You can't really generalize that into a healthy human population. And second, knowing the dose of choline that could potentially reverse that was not tested properly. So we have nothing between 50 and 500 milligrams. It wasn't tested at all. And so right now, I think that adequate intake is considered 550 milligrams for men, and I think it's 425 milligrams for women, maybe a little bit higher for women who are pregnant and lactating and so on and so forth. So that's the data that we have, and it's being hammered by different people of how important it is. And most of the high choline containing foods are red meat and animal products that could potentially have high saturated fats as well. But when you look at the population studies, on the other side, you see that people who have relatively lower intake of choline in the form of plants and vegetables and fruits and whole grains, they actually tend to do very well. They have lower risk of stroke. They have lower risk of cardiovascular disease and dementia as well. So there's a discrepancy with what is being recommended and what we actually know about the impact of choline on brain health. So I would say right now we really don't have objective evidence that choline or high doses of choline is important for brain health.
Okay. Beautiful. Clarifies a lot.
Wow.
And I would add and sort of extend on one thing that you said there to, I guess, give people another sort of degree of confidence here is if plant-based eaters were not consuming enough choline, and maybe you could argue that adequate is different to optimal, and how much you need to prevent poor liver health or fatty liver is different to cognition, granted, but we know that if you are deficient in choline, then there's a much higher risk of fatty liver. And so we would expect when you look at plant-based populations to see an increased risk of fatty liver, and you don't see that. You see the opposite.
Exactly.
Very
and then
true.
the other end of the spectrum is that high levels of choline have been associated with certain problems, whether it's cardiovascular and others as well. The data, as Ayesha said, is not clear. And then one other factor that we were just looking at today, I mean, even plant-based sources of choline, you get, from soy and
Yeah, you can
broccoli and
from
others.
tofu and whole grains and cruciferous vegetables. So it's not like choline is non-existent in plants. A lot of healthy foods have choline in them as well.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not adding it to my supplementation regime just yet. I would need more data to be convinced of that. Maybe if I was a woman who was pregnant, depending on my diet, then it might be a little bit more necessary.
Yeah. And prenatal vitamins actually tend to have a higher level of choline, so it kind of meets their needs.
Okay, I want to double click on some of these neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, dementia, or some of the other forms of dementia that perhaps we haven't spoken too much about previously, and Parkinson's, Huntington's, etc. So maybe just to kind of set the stage for that, you could just define what neurodegenerative disease actually means. If someone's hearing that for the first time and is thinking, that's a broad term, what does that encompass? And within that, what we're most likely to experience? What are the top neurodegenerative diseases that are affecting people in Western countries?
Yes. So that's neurodegenerative diseases are diseases that happen at an accelerated rate of cellular death. It's usually a process that's initiated years before the onset of the symptoms, but then at some point they become accelerated and the cell loss is significantly more than what you would see in normal age. How you differentiate the different kind of neurodegenerative diseases is twofold, actually threefold. One is timeline. Certain ones are very fast. That's not the most common. The other ones are the type of the proteins that accumulate or are part of the disease process, whether it's alpha-synuclein in Parkinson's and Lewy body disease or it's amyloid or tau, and so those pathologies tell you what are the causes, and also location early on. In fact, when people come to me for in a clinic when they're having early or even late disease, we usually have a family member there, and the first questions we ask is, when do you think this all started? And they say, oh, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago when they started having some problems. And what was the first signs? If it's memory problems, especially short-term memory, disproportionate to long-term memory, then it's more likely to have been Alzheimer's type. And so with dementia, it's not like other systemic disease where you can get a biopsy and say from the biopsy what the disease is. You can do that in humans as well. If you take a biopsy, it can tell you a lot. I looked at 1,000 brains when I was doing a fellowship at UCSD, looking at Lewy body, but we don't do that. We have to look at a consortium of things. One of the most important parts is history. And with frontotemporal dementia, it's different. Usually it's behavioral or language type. And those are the two main categories. And with Lewy body disease, it's movement disorder and cognitive together.
Lewy body being another form of
dementia. Yeah. With vascular dementia, it's stepwise declines. The person is fine, and then they had a little decline. Oh, I remember that in June something happened, and so that's one of the things. Or they had a major stroke. So the original stories give you a picture into what this could have been.
With Alzheimer's, why is it that it's typically short-term memory that's first affected?
Beautiful. Because the first area that's affected is the temporal lobe, specifically the hippocampus or the memory centers of the brain. Those are the areas that are first affected.
In most of these neurodegenerative conditions, the symptoms or the presentation is related to which part of the brain being affected first. Like, for example, in the frontotemporal lobe dementia, it's the frontal lobe. That's why people tend to have behavioral problems. They have disinhibition, they have fears, they have changes in their personality. So it's super interesting. Well, it's not pleasant for the patients, but it's interesting for the neurologist and the neuroscientist to actually depict the changes in the brain. And when you look at the structural and the functional changes in the brain too, it's in very specific areas of the brain.
And what's short term? Is that me forgetting where I put my keys half an hour ago? Is that forgetting who I spent time with the day before and had lunch with?
It's such a common question, because when my patients, especially the men, say, Dean, I'm fine. I can remember 50 years back. It's just the breakfast I forget sometimes, or where I lose the keys. That's short-term memory. And ironically, the long-term memory is preserved, not at least at the beginning. What happens with these diseases, they all at the end or in a few years, they all start looking the same because it starts involving all of the brain, right? It's the beginning that they're different. So short-term memory is breakfast, it's the keys being lost, it's a name that you were just told and you forget, but multiple of them. So those are short-term memory elements.
It's fascinating because when these patients come into the clinic, some of the mild Alzheimer's disease patients are the most eloquent, most friendly. Like, you would not be able to tell that they have Alzheimer's disease. They will start speaking to you about 20 years ago and all the details of their, say, for example, what kind of projects they did, what kind of places they went to, what kind of events they had. But then you talk to them and then you ask them what year it is, or what is the day today, or where do they live, and they have no recollection of that.
With frontotemporal lobe dementia patients, one variant of it, for example, we know that Bruce Willis was found to have frontotemporal, but semantic or language variety. So they're fine, they're working, they're doing it, but they can't find words. There are two kinds of language disorders. But the behavioral ones or executive function ones, their memory is fine. In fact, when you do the testing, their memory was fine. They've been doing everything, but they just forget the basic steps of how to program the TV, or even less complex, how to manage their checks, how to drive. They get in a car, they forget how to go through the process. So the frontal lobe executive, and that's a clue that's more frontal lobe.
That sounds very frustrating to find yourself in that position if you have the available cognition to recognize what's happening.
Yes, it's the most frustrating thing I've ever seen, and it's a lonely journey, because most of these people, they're all, in their 60s, 70s, 80s. A lot of my patients are people that have had interesting lives, all of them. I mean, great lives, and now they are not able to do the basic things, and a lot of times families don't recognize that. They don't know what's going on, and it's absolutely devastating.
For me, the reason I get upset very much, I've become a very negative and a pessimistic person. Well, not, I'm a nice person, but I get upset. About you. It is true, especially in the realm of Alzheimer's disease, when you hear all of these, individuals out there spreading misinformation about brain health and Alzheimer's disease. They haven't sat across an Alzheimer's patient. They haven't sat across their family to see how frustrated they can get. And they're just grabbing onto things, whatever is in front of them, to see if it can help. Right? So you can't give them false hope about this disease being reversed. And that's why whenever somebody says reversing Alzheimer's disease, be very careful with what you say, because you're playing with people's hopes. So
dementia, it's this umbrella term. Alzheimer's dementia is the most common form. Is that 60 or 70%?
Exactly. And then we have vascular dementia, which is about 10 to 20%.
And vascular dementia is not a neurodegenerative condition, but Correct. It is a major category of dementias.
Yeah. Because neurodegenerative, meaning that a process within the cells that slowly kills cells. And vascular, it's little mini strokes kind of a phenomenon. And we'll talk about that.
So different underlying mechanism, but sort of manifests in a similar way by affecting the brain.
Correct. And then we have frontotemporal lobe dementia, which is about 15% or so. Then we Lewy body dementia, Parkinson's dementia. And then we have all these other categories, which is multi-system atrophy, which are faster, much faster. They're a combination of Parkinson's and autonomic problems and movement disorders and cognition all in one, but in rapid form in 3, 4, 5 years. And then you have Huntington's dementia, and then lots of other smaller categories, post-traumatic or metabolic, alcohol. Yeah, Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, which is an alcohol.
And what about early onset Alzheimer's? Often that is a phrase that I've come across. What does that actually mean?
By definition, 65 and below. So anybody who develops dementia before age of 65, they call it early onset. A great majority of those are Alzheimer's type, the one type that I was talking about earlier, which is presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and APP. There are familial groups, like in Columbia University, huge communities that when you go there, you see 50-year-olds, a bunch of them in the same families who have this. But there's a lot of people that spontaneously develop this anomaly, this genetic abnormality. And it's a smaller proportion. 3 to 5% of all Alzheimer's, all dementia, and it's a little bit more rapid. And the other thing about this is, and the early onset, frontotemporal lobe is also earlier than Alzheimer's. So for the audience, if the symptoms are starting before 65, it could be early onset, it could be frontotemporal lobe dementia, but it could be other things as well, alcohol-related, Wernicke-Korsakoff, autoimmune diseases. There's these autoimmune diseases that can cause this, for example, Hashimoto's disease, in a small percentage that can develop dementia, and then paraneoplastic disorders. So there are other disorders as well, besides the early onset Alzheimer's, that can cause this.
If you have a parent who has frontotemporal dementia, what is your chance of following in their footsteps and also experiencing that?
With frontotemporal lobe dementia, it's more genetically driven. There are several genes, and there is a little bit higher propensity of familial translation, a connection. Not a much greater than Alzheimer's, but definitely a higher rate. But spontaneous genetic variants are more. That we're talking about, ORF9 and others that are more common in frontotemporal lobe dementia. And with frontotemporal lobe dementia, there's also a variant that is connected to ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease, motor neuron disease. So whenever you see frontotemporal dementia, a small percentage, about 5 to 10%, also have motor neuron disease.
Yeah, there's been a lot of awareness raised in Australia about motor neuron disease. A footballer, Neil Danaher, he was diagnosed, I think, 10 years ago, so a while, and it still seems to be remaining really positive. He's a really cheerful guy, and he set up Fight MND, which is a kind of charity organization raising funds. They've raised, I think, $60+ million at this stage in hope of, funding research that maybe can find a cure.
ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, is a devastating disease. Usually rapid, within 3 to 5 years, but people have lived with it longer. We're talking about Stephen Hawking, the physicist who lived with it for more than 40, 50 years. And it's where they start losing their ability to control their muscles, their peripheral muscles, sometimes most often even bulbar muscles, which is breathing and swallowing. So they have to be
intubated. Is that what they usually die from? Respiratory failure?
Yes. Exactly.
It's a tragic condition.
It is tragic. And we know very little, to be honest, even at this point, as far as its causation. There are many different mechanisms, genetic, superoxide dismutase, FUS genes, and others that people are looking at. But the true nature of it is still a little bit of an enigma.
Yeah, and if listeners are confused, because I think the terminology is slightly different in the United States to Australia. Over here, you tend to use ALS as sort of the main umbrella term. In Australia, I believe MND is used, but ALS is like the most common form of that.
It is.
That's right.
It is, exactly. Yes.
Coming back to dementia, actually all of these conditions, if someone's listening thinking, okay, what is my chances? Is it a 1 in 10 chance I'm going to get dementia? Is it a 1 in what chance am I going to get Parkinson's? Can we sort of put some perspective around this, around the likelihood that someone's going to experience some of these sort of more common neurodegenerative diseases?
The average person, this is not a person that lives a particularly healthy lifestyle, but the average person, 1 in 9 individuals over the age of 65 develop dementia and Alzheimer's type. And then after the age of 85, 50%, 47, but 50% develop dementia, and most likely Alzheimer's type dementia. And it's very prevalent, very common, and it's becoming more common for 2 reasons. One is we are living longer, although not in U.S. Our age actually dropped from 80 to 78 to now 76, going towards that. But the other reason is we're surviving other diseases, from cardiovascular disease and cancers and HIV and other things. So we're living to the point where we're more at risk of developing these diseases. And the third factor is we're living less healthy. We believe that, and there's data, it's not a matter of belief, that lifestyle is a big contributor of this. We think as much as 80% of this is lifestyle related. And it has to do with food we eat, with the way we interact, how much we move, the stress levels in our lives, lack of sleep or proper sleep, and then mental activity. These are the factors. And alcohol and cigarette smoking are other factors, especially alcohol. Cigarette, it's been reduced globally, but alcohol is a big factor. Those are the contributors and reversible contributors to risk of dementia.
And I think it's important for the audience to know, and this might just be a refresher because we've talked about this in the past, the proportion of people who tend to have a genetically driven disease is much less than those who have a lifestyle driven disease, especially when it comes to Alzheimer's disease. It's not even, it's not 50-50. If somebody has the genes or the type of Alzheimer's disease that is purely genetically driven, it's between 3 to 5% only. The rest of it is all lifestyle.
Those are the genes that typically would drive early onset Alzheimer's?
That's correct.
That's
exactly.
correct. So
which
those
is the
are the
presenilin.
Presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and amyloid precursor protein, or APP. And that happens to a very, very small population. So
I think some people may confuse that with ApoE4, which probably gets a little bit more airtime. So what happens to someone's risk if they have 1 copy of ApoE4 or 2 copies of?
So if you have one copy of ApoE4, your risk goes up as much as 3 to 4 times. If you have 2 copies, your risk goes up as much as 10 to 12 times. But does that mean that people who have ApoE4, 2 ApoE4 alleles, which is about 2% of the population in the United States, they all get dementia? No, 50% never develop dementia, and it's related to lifestyle. As the data shows that it's related to lifestyle. The Nigerian study actually showed this, and other studies have shown this. And then mechanistically, although we kind of push back on mechanistic explanation of things, it's a good thing to have. But what is the function of ApoE4? ApoE4 is one of its functions, not the only function, people simplify it. One of its is lipid transport, fat transport.
Right, it's the ApoB equivalent in the
Correct.
brain.
Exactly.
Correct.
Yes.
Exactly. And we know what it does in the brain. When it's in the brain, it doesn't do its job well. And our relationship with lipids, especially LDL, matter because of one of the reasons ApoE4. So even the second highest penetrant genes, and I'll explain what penetrance means. If a gene is 100% penetrant, it means it's going to manifest in our life at a particular time. For example, the Huntington's gene. It's on chromosome 4. It's a sad disease, and it's repeats of CAG codon. And if there's a certain number of them, it's almost guaranteed that this parent had it, their child now has it. We know at what age they're going to develop Huntington's disease. Usually it's in the 30s or so. With Alzheimer's, it's just that 3 to 5%. The rest are not 100% penetrance. It's much lower. Even ApoE4, which is a higher penetrance, 12 times greater risk, people who live a certain kind of life have much lower risk of developing Alzheimer's. And then the rest of the consortium of genes related to Alzheimer's, which we now know to be now in the 40 or so genes, are, again, lifestyle related. Genes that deal with how we get rid of waste. Very common. Genes that have to do with our response to inflammatory response. If there are bad genes, which means we don't have a good, proper inflammatory response, more likely to get dementias and other diseases. So again, we can see that genes here have to do with lifestyle, a great majority of them.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything someone can do if they have those mutations to presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and are in that sort of, I think you said 3 to 5% of category? Are they just ultimately, they're destined to get dementia, or can they, even in that circumstance, modify their lifestyle in a way that...
That's a really good question.
Very good question. So we did a study. We looked at the data. We didn't do the study. We looked at the data. We need to publish that.
Yes.
And with an amazing 16-year-old kid that ended up in Stanford, brilliant young man. We looked at who has APP. Well, it's on chromosome 21.
Amyloid precursor.
Yeah. So
protein.
who has excessive APP are people who have triple chromosome 21, which are Down syndrome, right? So people with Down syndrome, if they live past the age of 40, 50, it's almost a foregone conclusion they will develop dementia and Alzheimer's. And it's because of excessive APP. And we looked at that data, and what we saw was the main problems that usually Down syndrome individuals have is blood pressure, cholesterol, all of that stuff. When those things were better managed, guess what? They developed the disease later on. So even in the high penetrant genes like APP in Down syndrome, lifestyle had an influence on pushing the disease back. So that gives you a clue that even in those cases, lifestyle is a big factor.
It's almost as if you were given poor tools to maintain a healthier brain. It's like you're not given the right kind of a janitorial system for your brain. You're not given the right kind of a system to get rid of oxidative stress. You're not given the right kind of system to fight against inflammation. And so if you work hard enough not to create that inflammatory response, not to create that oxidative stress, and not to create those glucose metabolism disorders and fat metabolism disorders, you can definitely push the disease further.
We'll make sure we break down neuro again so people understand what that lifestyle, ultimately, what does it look like? What are the behaviors and actions on a daily basis that you can take to sort of swing this in your favor, regardless of whatever genes you've sort of been dealt. So, Dean, on what you just said before, I'm trying to almost just run the maths here. On an individual basis, so we have like a 1 in 9, 1 in 10 chance of developing dementia. If you have one copy of ApoE4, that's like a 1 in 5, and then if you have 2 copies, 1 in 2, something like that.
Correct.
But you're of the view that we can lower our risk, for that risk, by up to 80-90% by getting our lifestyle in order.
Correct. Now, 90% is super optimal. 90% is the extrapolation. We always want to make sure that when we speak, we don't just put all that we say into one clump. There's weight of data, right? This is a causal data, which is very rare, strongly correlated data that comes from a meta-analysis of randomized clinical trials, and so on and so forth. When we talk about 90%, it's the extrapolation of taking all the work that we've looked at, nutrition having 50% influence on dementia, exercise 45 and above, just some of the studies. If you put all of this together, we're extrapolating. So take it for that. I say that exhaustively so that people say that when we speak, we try to be not about just data, but the weight of the data as well. And that's important. But if we believe that if somebody lives perfectly optimal life for a long period of time, especially early on, yes, you can 80%, 90% reduction in risk. But even the data that came to us from subpar studies that was published we actually saw in the American Alzheimer's Association conferences and other places, that even subpar lifestyles reduce your risk by as much as 60%. That's remarkable, because none of those studies push the kind of lifestyle we talk about. We're talking about, push the exercise to 300 minutes a week. There was a time we talked about 150 minutes. We're talking about 300, close to 300 minutes, and push yourself, including weight training. We're talking about as clean a diet as possible, as plant-centered. If you're not going to be plant-only, as plant-predominant as possible, as clean as possible, and be aware of your vitamin. And just because you're plant-aware or clean diet, it doesn't mean that you should then ignore other things. Be aware of your omega-3. Be aware of your B12. Be aware of your vitamin D. Be aware of your thyroid status and other things, irrespective of your diet. Be aware of your blood pressure and cholesterol. And if you are aware of all of that and you're eating well and clean and exercising, sleeping well, 7 to 8 hours of deep restorative sleep, challenging your brain around your purpose, yes, you can push back Alzheimer's and dementia by as much as 80 to 90%.
A lot of what you just explained comes down to taking ownership. And I guess there's I don't like using the word balance, but you need to work out a way where you integrate this into your lifestyle where it doesn't feel like a chore. Yes. And it's not stressful and anxiety provoking in and of itself, or you're kind of defeating the point a little bit. So we might come back to that.
I'd say change it from lifestyle to life, because if it's not life, it's only sustainable for so long. The power of our habits are immense. I'm a behavioral neurologist. The most difficult thing to change is our habits. Those habits are not just something that was created in our early life. They're created around our psychological flaws. They're sticky. So in order to change behavior, you really have to make it your identity. It has to become part, not as an extra thing. I'm going to be eating more plants today. No, that should be you. That should be your life. I'm going to, do a practice for a marathon this month. I'm a runner. I'm a walker. I'm an exerciser. That becomes a more realistic, sustainable thing than a lifestyle.
I think one of the challenges here is that you're talking about lifetime exposures to risks, but a lot of people could, when they're thinking about neurodegenerative disease and dementia, you associate it with older people. So you have to really engage in delayed gratification to make this work, because you're going to be choosing behaviors and actions that are protecting you many, many years down the road.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there are some short-term benefits that they can actually, when they're aware of, they can see. For example, you sleep, when you live a certain way of life, your sleep will improve, your attention will improve, your mood will improve. We don't ever measure those. We don't make ourselves cognizant of those things. It's time. It's time to kind of create metrics for your focus.
That's a good point. There are some benefits up for grabs.
Oh, right away.
And I wanted to add that when people think of brain health, they essentially just dichotomize it into being healthy and unhealthy. If we think of brain health as a spectrum and as a journey, I think it would make more sense. The fact that we have tools only to detect dementia in a population is so wrong. There is a huge sector of population that live with cognitive decline, and nobody ever checks that. And that cognitive decline doesn't necessarily start happening in our 60s or 70s. It actually starts happening in our 30s and 40s. And this is not fear mongering, but it's just an indication
A little bit.
that it's scary, just a tiny bit. But it's an indication that, these individuals that come into our clinic, and these are, say, for example, a 35-year-old working mom who says, I'm just forgetful. I don't remember things. I'm so forgetful of what happens. It's actually affecting my life. It's not something to be scared of, but that's cognitive decline. We experience it in our 40s. We have people who actually have high blood pressure, and there's a term called, hypertensive encephalopathy, where their blood pressure is so high that they can't really focus on things. They're actually confused. They lose their train of thought in the middle of a conversation, let alone come up with creative thoughts. That happens in our 50s and our 60s. People who have diabetes, they actually have poor memory as well. Nobody ever checks that. We always talk about, amyloid, brain shrinkage, but that's as if, an analogy would be if there's a car accident, and we just saw a car accident on the highway coming here, everybody focuses on the damaged car. There's ambulance, there's police, there's firefighters, all focusing on the damaged car. They don't really look at the road that led to that. They don't actually look at the engine that was, something was wrong with the engine, or they don't really look at so many other factors that resulted into that as well. So there's a lot of cognitive decline out there in the population. And if people are just aware of that fact, I think it will make them take better care of themselves.
So that after my previous statement, people don't feel this overwhelming impetus to abandon this whole thing because it's all or none. It's not. A morning walk, the Harvard study, a brisk morning walk, a brisk walk in general, but especially I love brisk morning walk, and we'll talk about why. But a brisk walk, with the operative term being brisk, where you get tired. I keep coming back to that theme. If you think exercise is not just meandering and walking, you got to get tired. Reduced chance of Alzheimer's by 45%. 45%. Do we have any drug, any of those vitamin concoctions that they sell? None of them have shown even 1% of improvement. None of them. Yet a brisk walk, 45%. And the power of exercise is just immense. And you'll see the difference. You'll see it in mood alteration. You'll see it in better sleep. You'll see it in cognition, especially if you make yourself aware of it. Let me see if this experiment I'm running, where I'm going to walk every morning, is going to affect my focus. And you'll see the difference. So I want people to kind of shift towards those kind of metrics as well.
Also out of Harvard was the Harvard Adult Development Study. I'm not sure if you've seen that. You probably have. You've probably spoken about it, where they were tracking, I think they were tracking university students for like 80 years. And the ones that are still alive, they're still tracking today, who remarkably are probably in their 90s or so. But one really interesting thing that I noticed in their data and listening to one of their lead researchers was, more than fame or money or anything else, relationships. Close relationships
the
were
number one factor.
Great predictor. The number one predictor, in fact,
Yes.
above cholesterol, above blood pressure, above obesity, above everything when it came to total mortality and also neurodegenerative conditions. What is it, do you think, about close relationships that seems to protect the brain?
We interviewed the author of one of the PIs and the author of the book that came out of that just recently. And relationships are complex. More complex for the wives, but they're complex nonetheless.
I don't know why you said that.
Yeah, no, I'm men. But relationships are complex. They're not just about the relationship. If it's a good relationship, even if it's a bad relationship, to be honest, it's a process where people are interacting. Talk about cognitive activity. Loneliness is a major determinant of cognitive decline. Hearing loss as a major determinant of cognitive decline in dementia, 9%. So just people interacting with each other, two people constantly interacting with it, even if they're bickering and fighting, it's interacting. That's complexity, that's challenge. They're talking to each other, they're listening, they're adapting, they're learning. They're if it's on a negative side, or better if it's on a positive side. So all of that matters. As far as taking care of each other, we know that men that are married do a lot better. Some of that data has been overstated, but in general, men that are married they live longer, they're much healthier because their partner takes care of them, and vice versa. So that level of activity. We know that husbands that are unhealthy, or wives, the partner is also going to be unhealthy. But the other side is true as well. The likelihood of two people maintaining health for each other because they have common values, common structures, common behaviors, common habits after years of marriage, and also they have more want to stay healthy is more. So there are lots of roads that come to the same end, which is health, as far as cognition, as far as the impetus to be healthier in many, many different ways.
And you know what the interesting thing is about this? So they've done studies, the Nun study and this particular study as well. It's so fascinating. Cognitive resilience seems to protect you from dementia, even if you have the pathology in your brain. So even with amyloid deposition and all the other pathophysiological changes that we see in dementia, if people have cognitive reserve, which is something that you build throughout your life by being active, by being with, a lovely partner, having conversations and being busy in life, those connections are protective. It's fascinating. So not everything is vascular ridden, not everything, the outcome is not just based on the vascular risk factors and micronutrients and the supplements and the diet and the exercise. Cognitive resilience is such a huge part of brain health. And another interesting thing is, that they always depict that women have a higher risk for dementia compared to men. Why is that? Twice as high. So one of the reasons is because after menopause, the estrogen receptors, they go down. There's not much estrogen in the brain and so on and so forth. So that theory is being studied quite a lot. And there is a huge role that hormones play in maintaining brain health. But another factor that has been highlighted, this is theoretical right now, is that the studies that show us that women are at a higher risk of dementia come from a time when women were not involved in complex and challenging occupations. They were mostly housewives. They were mostly, taking care of the household. So they were not really challenged. And that is changing now that women are more involved in complex and challenging occupations. That is changing. So the data that we have was actually tested on women that probably did not have enough cognitive resilience.
I want to make sure that people don't take that as a politically correct statement. That's not. It's facts. It's data.
And it actually is a motivating factor for us to implement or make sure that cognitive resilience takes a very huge part and parcel of this whole lifestyle that we're talking about.
The one thing that makes our approach different, yes, nutrition is the same for cardiac, for cancer, for everything else. Exercise, pretty much the same, although we talk about the leg strength and its unique effect on brain health, sleep, but cognitive reserve is something that is very unique and it's critical. And people who have been very cognitively active and then they retire and they don't do as much, they have the steepest decline. Mm-hmm. So that's an important factor to take into all this. Challenge your brain. Challenging your brain creates that infrastructure I was talking about before, those pillars that create the protection later on.
Mm. And we have a lot of challenge when we're a young child or we're a teenager. There's so many challenges during that period where our brain is rapidly developing, but then we become adults and we often just do the same thing over and over.
Repetition. Yeah. Yes.
There's a term, there's a phrase, idea density.
My favorite term.
Yeah, Dean always says if we have a band, we'll call it idea density.
Right, so we want high idea density as opposed to calorie density.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So your idea density is directly correlated with cognitive longevity.
Is that something you can measure?
You can,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
But by the way, it's not IQ. It's not. It's the so the nun study showed that the nuns that had a higher cognitive capacity and were protected in spite of pathology had much higher idea density, more complex vocabulary, more complex language, more complex layers of communication. Those are all idea densities. Terms.
So how would we go and test that if someone's listening and thinking, I'd love to understand where my idea density is at?
There are measurements that actually can quantify that. The simple one is vocabulary. How expansive is your vocabulary? That's one thing. The other thing is how expansive is your knowledge of history and philosophy, and then these kind of things, if that matters. But idea density, I think, it goes beyond those measurable things. For example, somebody who's into music, let's say. And that's a form of idea, right? But they're not just doing the same thing again, like me, who plays the same 4 chords terribly over and over again, and I can't get out of it.
Come on.
But they're on the creative side, and they're, we listen to the jazz musician, bassist, Stanley Clarke.
Stanley Clarke. Oh, man.
Oh
he's
my
amazing.
goodness.
Stanley
Talk
Clarke
about-
is the GOAT.
So he is creating on the go continuously. That's a person who's challenging their brain around that kind of idea. It's about, so we did the meta-analysis in 2008. It was published in 2019, I think, that looked at cognition or cognitive activities in MCI patients. Very good
Mild
paper,
cognitive
mild
impairment.
cognitive impairment patients. Incredible. And out of that came, if you have weakness, work around your weakness. This is not what you usually say in other realms. Work around your strength. No. With cognition, if you find a weakness, strengthen that. If it's memory, strengthen it. If it's focus, strengthen that, and so on and so forth. The other things we found as a paraphenomenon was purpose, complexity, and purpose and complexity and challenge are 3 factors. Purpose means activities that are serving your purpose, activities that are meaningful to you. It's like complexity means if it's Sudoku, it's fine. But if it's real life activities like a podcast, I mean, the amount of brain work you put into organizing this, I mean,
I hope so.
I know so. I mean, it's immense. It's immense. So that's complexity as opposed to playing Sudoku. And then challenges, keep pushing yourself. Because if it becomes, you said it earlier, people to get in their 30s and they do the same thing over and over again. But even in this, if you're doing the same thing over again, it becomes a checklist, then it's no longer challenging. It's not pushing the brain to make the connections. If people just build their cognitive life around those factors, purpose, complexity, and challenge, they'll create an incredible amount of
It
reserve.
also keeps life interesting.
It does. It does.
To constantly find your weak points and keep challenging yourself. One of my challenges, other than this podcast, that I've been embarking on lately is padel, which is like pickleball.
Oh.
Have you seen that game?
No.
So it's very big in Europe. It's actually, they've just opened, there's one court down near you guys.
Oh,
and
wow.
there's one court in Santa Monica. I have no affiliation with these guys. They're massive across Europe and in parts of Asia and in Australia. And it's kind of a hybrid between squash and tennis.
Oh, I
so
think
small court,
yeah.
but you can hit off the back wall.
Yes, yes.
It's a great game because people of all ages can play this. You don't have to be a skilled, experienced tennis player. In fact, in many ways, it probably helps if you're not.
Yeah.
You don't bring the same sort of habits, I guess, to the game because it's very different, but it's highly strategic. So there's a lot of thinking involved, and I've been finding that
I
challenging.
love that.
I love
Yes,
that so
yes,
much.
yes. I was a tennis player, so I'll definitely try that out. Yeah.
Maybe I can beat you finally.
You will definitely do that.
I want to come back to ApoE4
Yes.
and amyloid plaque and the kind of pathology of Alzheimer's dementia, because I know that's very topical. It's been controversial recently. But before I do, one thing that we were just speaking there about relationships that I came to mind was, I think often when people hear that, some people who are, say, single or maybe they're divorced, they're in their 40s or 50s, they're left sort of thinking, wow, I'm at increased risk of dementia here. My question to you is, do you think, and I guess I'm of the view that being single or being divorced is not necessarily synonymous with loneliness. And so you can be single and absolutely thriving and still finding the challenges in building social connections. And I guess we probably shouldn't conflate being single with loneliness. And some people probably do really well with solitude.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's a very good point. Yeah, because there are some people who are introverts, and we get asked about this question, like, I don't really enjoy being in circles of people and having conversations. Can I still have a healthier brain? And the answer is absolutely. I think the key thing to understand is, how much do you challenge yourself? That challenge is easy on a day-to-day basis if you're speaking with someone, because you take care of so many variables, being respectful, knowing what the person is interested in, not being mean and selfish. All of that takes a lot of hard work.
She looked at me there, but
no. So all of those things are very important, and it's easy. On a day-to-day basis, because we're human beings and it just comes naturally. But if you can replace that with a task that requires or kind of checks off those elements, focus, attention, being on your feet, making sure that you are always thinking and you're being challenged on a regular basis, obviously, I think people do very, very well.
I fully agree. Yeah.
Okay, that will be good news for many people.
Yes,
sure. So back to ApoE4. You mentioned before, it's this protein that helps carry lipids, fats, and cholesterol in the brain, similar to ApoB through the body. So some people can have one copy or two copies of that. What is it about ApoE4 is it related to amyloid plaque? And if someone doesn't have ApoE4, they just have another form of ApoE transporting fats that's a bit more benign?
So that's what makes not just Alzheimer's, but all disease, but especially disease of the brain, interesting, because it's almost like 5-dimensional chess. They're all connected. So let me give you an example. So ApoE2 is protective. It does its job of transporting lipids efficiently to the right place, not get overwhelmed, not create secondary inflammation. Inflammation is always involved in all of this.
ApoE2 being... So if you have two copies of ApoE4, you don't have ApoE2.
Correct.
These are all sort of alternative
proteins. They're exclusionary. So if you have two ApoE2s, you're very protected. The data shows, and that's because of its efficiency, not just because of its lipid transport, inflammation, all of that. All these systems are involved through inflammation, glucose dysregulation, lipid dysregulation, which is ApoE4, oxidation. They're connected. And not just in Alzheimer's, but also in, for example, we think that ALS and frontotemporal lobe dementia, there's a lot of oxidative damage that's involved and genetics around that. But they're not exclusive of each other. It depends on where in that journey each of them come in, right? So with ApoE4, lipid transport is bad. It accumulates. It causes vascular damage. It causes damage to the endothelial lining. It causes damage to the blood-brain barrier, which is incredibly important, which is supposed to be non-porous and creates this enclosed environment for the brain and spinal cord where nothing can come in or very little can come in, but it becomes more porous because of the fact that ApoE4 is over time causing improper lipid deposition, lipid processing, secondary inflammation, and then after that comes the cellular inflammatory products that then cause secondary damage. Then what happens is, as we get older, amyloid creation is part of our body. The APP is a normal transmembrane protein. It gets cut in the wrong place with beta secretase and gamma secretase, which causes amyloid deposition.
So transmembrane protein, meaning this protein is like inside the cell, the neuron?
It goes from inside the cell through the membrane and outside.
And then it gets cleaved.
It's cleaved, and usually gets cleaved. If it's by alpha, it's in the right place, and it's fine. But if it gets miscleaved, it creates these clumping. Now, the clumping in itself happens anyway with aging. It accumulates. We know that a lot of people have amyloid and they're normal. But what happens is, we believe, and is that if there's inflammation, this clumping becomes more sticky.
This is the amyloid hypothesis?
Yes, amyloid hypothesis. It becomes more sticky. It's no longer soluble. It becomes insoluble. It becomes bound. And then it brings in cellular immunity. And then the damage process starts. And here's the other thing. there's an infectious kind of phenomenon going on. This clumpy amyloid, which also affects the tau, and vice versa. I'll talk about the tau in a second, another abnormal protein in Alzheimer's, then actually seeds other amyloid to become from insoluble to soluble. So they start affecting other amyloid, and it becomes a process that spreads.
And so if someone's trying to visualize this, right?
Yes.
So I think of cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis, probably because I spend more time reading about it and thinking about it. And so I can picture that fatty plaque on the inside of the artery, and the downstream repercussions of that are lack of oxygen to important tissues, brain or to the heart. Here, if I'm hearing what you're saying correctly, and I'm admittedly not very well read in this at all, but I'm really interested in this underlying like cascade of events that occur that precede Alzheimer's. So outside of the cell, there's this amyloid, a range of different factors like inflammation that can cause clumping together.
Correct.
Then amyloid plaques is extracellular. It affects communication between neurons.
It affects communication between neurons, and these clumps actually then, so there's amyloid, liquid amyloid in the milieu of the brain, right, in the outside of a cell. The soluble amyloid is not as problematic. When it clumps, then becomes a problem. We think that the clumping happens more with inflammation. We think the clumping happens more with glucose dysregulation, insulin resistance, and other things, and multiple other factors. And that's what propagates this process from being a normal part of life, aging, to one of pathology. And then also it affects cell intercellularly, which is the tau protein. I'll get to that in a second. But this clumping then actually seeds other soluble amyloids to clump together. Imagine these clumps just growing, initially in the temporal lobe, but then to the parietal lobe, and then throughout the cell. In fact, if you look at the pathology studies by Brock and Brock, these are another husband and wife pathologist, very famous in neuroscience, they looked at how these diseases actually grew. It was almost like infectious. In fact, a lot of people thought it was infectious because it was started at the path of smell, the olfactory, right? It connects to the temporal lobe, and then it starts in the temporal lobe, the amyloid buildup, and the clumping, and the cell death, and then it grows to the parietal lobe. It's almost like a spread, and then it spreads to the whole brain. But it's not an infectious process. We think it's the seeding that this amyloid.
So what's the just to backtrack a little bit?
Yes,
right?
It's a little complicated.
So if I'm thinking again about atherosclerosis, and I think there's pretty much consensus that ground zero is an elevation in these ApoB containing lipoproteins, LDLs being the main one.
Yes.
And that sort of is enough. That's a necessary component for this disease to occur.
Correct.
And you can throw petrol on the flame with diabetes or high blood pressure or smoking. All of these things can exacerbate the risk. But a critical component to the cascade is elevation of ApoB. That makes cardiovascular disease in many ways easy to treat, because you can then design therapeutics and lifestyle things that go direct to the start of the cascade.
Yes.
You can address the other things as well to try and bring the total risk down, but it helps knowing what is ground zero.
Yes.
In what you just described, is it the cleaving of that amyloid precursor protein? Is it incorrectly being cleaved? Is that the initial problem, or is that normal, that cleaving?
So the scientific world that's creating all these antibodies to treat amyloid are betting on that hypothesis, that the beginning or the nidus is that cleaving or miscleaving. We think the data doesn't show that. We think that it's an important. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think amyloid is a very important part, but we think it's downstream. Upstream is vascular. Upstream, it's the cholesterol. Upstream is the diabetes, the untreated. Upstream, it's the blood pressure. All this damage that pushes a normal process of aging, which is just amyloid accumulation anyway, into something pathologic. And we think that the reason that we're not getting a cure, or even the drugs that the latest one that showed 30-something% slowing.
Eli Lilly's
drug, yeah.
Right.
It's not a cure. It just slows the process. It's because you're just taking just part of the picture, which is the amyloid cascade, and not taking into account all the upstream pathologies.
So that drug was targeting amyloid and was able to reduce
Yes.
amyloid.
Yes.
And
Significantly.
and they slowed progression by 35%. So from an individual's point of view, let's pretend someone with Alzheimer's dementia takes that drug, gets that effect. From a sort of behavior point of view, would they have restoration of memories that they've lost?
No. So that's a very good point to raise. So in the normal evolution of the disease, you tend to see decline in cognition year after year after year. It's a progressive disease.
At a certain rate.
At a certain rate, yes. And after giving individuals this infusion of monoclonal antibodies, 50% of them did not have progression of their disease, close to 50%. I think it was 47%. So that was significant. But what it does, those medications, whether it's the donanemab or the one previous to that, which is lecanemab and all these MABs, monoclonal antibodies, what they do is they get rid of those clumps of amyloid, the end byproducts that are toxic in the extracellular space.
I wish they came up with easier names.
I know.
I know. Yeah, they're very long and
Okay.
it's difficult to pronounce.
So walk us through the controversy then. The amyloid plaque sort of controversy in Science, I think it was 12 months ago. And I believe you were a mentor to kind of a central figure in this who sort of unearthed what became described as fraudulent science. And there was a lot of different takes in the media and on social media, and many people were using that story as a way of saying, look, the whole amyloid hypothesis has been debunked. It's not worth focusing on amyloid at all, which I guess is conflicting with even just the evidence that you just presented then with that drug. Like, that still seems beneficial to someone if you can delay their progression. It's not a cure, and it's probably not what we're all hoping for.
Absolutely.
But targeting amyloid in that circumstance seems to be doing something.
Correct.
So walk us through what this whole controversy was a result of and what, I guess, your perspective is.
Absolutely. So generally speaking in science, science is fraught with mistakes and errors and learning from those errors and moving on. In this particular situation, what happened was back in 2006, there was a research article that was published in a very reputable journal by a scientist, Lesner. And essentially what had happened was he made a mistake as far as his presentation of the images that depicted amyloid deposition in the brain. That's the short of it. Basically, the images that he showed in the paper and the data that he presented in the paper were flawed. He basically, if I had to simplify it, almost kind of copy-pasted some of the imaging, and he produced it as evidence for amyloid being the reason why people tend to have Alzheimer's disease. Before that, there had been a lot of research done. The amyloid hypothesis was something that was replicable, was validated, and was seen in multiple different animal and human models. After that as well, there were a lot of imaging studies, pathology studies that did confirm the fact that amyloid was a part of Alzheimer's disease and its evolution, right? So now what happened was, there was a scientist in Vanderbilt University, Dr. Matthew Schrag, who was, that particular story in itself, he was actually asked by a few people to look into it. He was actually asked by some people to look into the data. So he went back and he collected the raw data and the raw supplemental files to find out how we came up with this hypothesis. And he found some issues with that. He did actually find out that the data wasn't presented properly. And so he raised a flag. And he did an interview and he said, this theory is based on flawed models. That particular theory was based on flawed models, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all our understanding of amyloid and Alzheimer's disease is flawed. We still have enough data to show that amyloid is important. The way it was propagated in the media, as it always is, was just, oh my gosh, everything we know about Alzheimer's disease has been garbage. This whole amyloid theory is useless. We've spent billions of dollars on nothing, and that wasn't true.
So that wasn't necessarily Matthew Schrag's take. He just put forward what he found, and then other people interpreted that.
Absolutely. He specifically pointed that 2006 paper, which was a very important,
highly cited paper,
monumental
highly
cited paper, and said the imaging that was depicted in this paper was based on flawed models, and this needs to be corrected.
Was it flawed and just a simple oversight, or do you think it was purposeful? And are there kind of negative repercussions of that, in that a lot of funding and research may have gone into something that was not a path that would have otherwise been followed?
It definitely affected science. I mean, it's all about, in science, it's not absolute. It's not binary. It's a spectrum, right? So I always say, it's not about truth. It's a weight of the truth. If you overweight a truth, it's a fallacy. If you underweight a truth, it's a fallacy. So this data actually pushed the science a little too much towards amyloid. Not that it doesn't deserve attention. Not that research shouldn't be done on it. But it shouldn't be an end-all, be-all, that's what happened after this, pretty much. Yeah.
I think it had already started many, many years ago, where drug after drug being failed, people looking at specific amyloid models and not getting anywhere, had started. I think Dean and I were like the main people in the field of neurology who kind of just raised that question, like, hey, maybe it's time we stop looking only at amyloid hypothesis and maybe look at everything else. But there's a lot of research that now shows the overlap between vascular, disorders or disorders of neurovascular unit and the development of Alzheimer's disease. So that's what it actually propelled. It made whether this came from nefarious intent, we don't know. Whether this came from, the scientists wanting to get some sort of fame out of this, we don't know. And I don't want to imply anything because I don't know the details very well.
Right. That would be unfair. It would probably need to be fully investigated.
Yeah.
To
it is still under investigation, yes.
Determine that. I did find it interesting that I believe Matthew Schrag was initially engaged, a lawyer called him, and it was a lawyer that had been engaged from a couple of gentlemen who actually were shorting a pharmaceutical stock that was bringing out a drug that was being sort of marketed as a drug that could cure Alzheimer's, and these guys shorted that stock because they believed that the science didn't support it and that drug was going to fail.
Yeah. Matthew was in Loma Linda, actually. Dean.
I was one of his mentors, and he's a brilliant person.
Man.
Yes,
he's a brilliant man, and I know that he probably just looked into it to clarify things, and something else came out of it.
So with amyloid plaque and drugs targeting amyloid plaque, and I think that quote of 99% of drug trials targeting it have failed. One thing that I've kind of been thinking about here is whether that means targeting amyloid has limited utility, or let's say we come back to atherosclerosis, right? We know that early intervention is really critical. And so if you give someone a statin and they're 60 years old and they've had decades and decades of exposure, yes, you can get an effect, but it's not as great as people who have low cholesterol genetically from Mendelian studies that we see. Like, the magnitude of risk reduction is far superior. Is the field looking at, whether it's in susceptible people like those with ApoE4, 1 copy or 2, or others with the presenilin genes, looking at what about targeting amyloid earlier in life, well before someone actually has dementia? And, I guess coming back to atherosclerosis, there's a lot of talk of cholesterol years, which is very similar to sort of cigarette pack years. Your total cholesterol exposure over a number of years is determining your total risk of having a heart attack. Is it possible that it's a similar sort of circumstance here?
It is. And much of the research that's going after early detection of disease process is with this in mind, which is the earlier you detect the beginnings of a pathology, the more likely that you will affect its outcome. We really think that there's a point of no return. There's a point where the damage is so much and this seeding of amyloid is so rapid that pulling it back is going to be difficult. You can slow it down, but pulling it back is going to be difficult. And a lot of the studies that are being done now as far as biomarkers are focused at this, or imaging markers are focused at this. We already have some of the biomarkers, which is we look at cerebrospinal fluid. We look at
How
the
do you
ratio
sample that?
From the lower spine at L4. We put a needle in and draw fluid, and it's not as bad as it sounds. And then we send it out, and we look for amyloid and tau ratio. Initially, they're both high, but later what happens is amyloid goes down and tau goes up, and that ratio tells us that this is most likely Alzheimer's. That ratio is very, very diagnostic.
Is
but
that
if you catch it
predictive?
early,
Is that predictive in that, let's say, let's take Limitless, for example, Chris Hemsworth's story. That was, mainstream news across the world. 2 copies of ApoE4. Is this something, are there biomarkers that someone in that circumstance could look at that go a bit deeper than blood pressure and cholesterol and HbA1c? You mentioned all of that stuff before, which is of course critical in the risk calculation, but is there any more specific biomarkers early in life someone can do if they want to go that step further?
So the ones I was talking about, amyloid and tau, you can actually tell 10 years before there's a pattern coming towards. I mean, it's not very directly predictive, but it gives you a picture of risk. The others that we're looking at, we don't have them now. A lot of people are saying they do, but we don't, is what's called exosomes. That would be more useful because people are not willing to do lumbar punctures every few years or every year. That's invasive. But what if you can draw from the blood or retina? And I'll tell you about the retina, which we were involved in. But looking at the blood, and from that having biomarkers that are predictive. So exosomes are these little clumps of micelles or round byproducts of cells that are extruded out of the central nervous system, and you can detect them in the blood. They're in small numbers, but you can detect them. And in the past, we thought that they were just garbage. The cell is throwing out that it's garbage. But no, there are different exosomes, and some of them actually give you a good picture of the pathologies of Alzheimer's, be it amyloid and tau. And so now we're looking at those, and we're becoming better and better and better at using that as a predictor of dementia and earlier. That's one way. The other way is retina, looking at the retina, because human retina is a continuation of the central nervous system. So when we were at Cedars-Sinai, we have these tools to look at the retina, whether it's vascular damage in the retina or amyloid deposition in the retina or patterns of change in the retinal structure. That is being used to study the downstream dementia risk. So that's another way to look at it. And then there are imaging modalities such as PET scan, MRI techniques, fMRI, but especially PET scans are very good because with PET scans, what you do is you put a ligand that connects to amyloid, and then you can see it in the brain. Oh, look, there's this much amyloid in the brain. Or now we have tau ligand, which is much more predictive. And so you can look at the tau deposition in the brain and say, oh, wait a second, this person doesn't have any dementia, but the pattern looks suspicious. So those are other tools that we have, and we're getting better and better at using those to detect earlier and earlier. And here's the last one. We now know that microvascular disease, which we didn't used to follow in the brain, actually happens earlier than even amyloid deposition. And as you were saying, what's the seed? Well, maybe it is microvascular disease.
So you think that could lead to the amyloid plaque?
Correct. Absolutely. So that's another thing that we are looking at with this newer tools. Now, the MRIs we use in the United States is 1.5 Tesla, but with higher powered MRIs, you can look at microvascular disease years before any pathology.
Is that related to the blood-brain barrier? Same conversation?
It is.
Definitely,
It is,
yes.
definitely. Absolutely.
What do you think, if you were to kind of hypothesize now, would be the main things that would be driving microvascular damage?
What drives the microvascular damage? Cholesterol, LDL, saturated fat, diabetes, high blood
So
pressure.
here we're talking about things peripheral
Peripheral
to the brain.
to the brain. We think that those are the easy low-hanging fruit, but also true drivers of majority of dementias, but especially Alzheimer's dementia and vascular dementia. Those are the main drivers. And those are simple ones.
Maybe it would be worth kind of just high level describing what the blood-brain barrier is and why microvasculature is important, how this kind of fits into this puzzle.
Yeah, so the blood-brain barrier is a system. It's essentially a barrier and a wall between the brain and the circulatory system. And this wall is made of endothelial cells. They're very tiny cells with very, very tight junctions, which means that they really don't have any gap to allow things from your circulation, from your blood, to go into the brain. And they have specific kind of receptors or little gates that allow things like glucose and fat and some other very tiny molecules to pass through the gate. It's like living in a very high security area where everything is checked and only specific people are allowed to go in. That's how I would actually analogize the blood-brain barrier. And it is essentially a protective mechanism for the brain to stay in that little compartment and not be affected by things. One of the reasons why a lot of medications have failed in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease is because of an intact blood-brain barrier. It doesn't allow a lot of drugs and molecules to go in there. It actually doesn't even allow saturated fats, as much as we hear people say that saturated fat is important for brain health. It doesn't allow cholesterol. It just doesn't get through. It doesn't have the gates or the mechanisms for it. And so how is this endothelium connected to our circulatory system? It's essentially the tiny little capillaries. If people, for the audience, if you can imagine the heart gives out this big major artery called the aorta, and then this aorta gets dissected and divided into different kind of arteries. Then you have the internal carotid artery and the external carotid arteries, and they go and branch out into your brain into specific kind of arteries going into your frontal lobe, temporal lobe, and parietal lobe, and then they keep on branching and branching and branching into tiny, tiny little capillaries and arteries. And when you measure that, you have about 400 miles of these tiny little capillaries in one brain, in one human brain. And so imagine the branching and the thinning out. And the reason why it had to be that way is because the brain is a very active organ and it needs nutrients and oxygen at all times. So the blood-brain barrier is that final place where there is exchange of material from our blood into the brain. How does it get damaged? It gets damaged with things that damage our vasculature. As we age, atherosclerotic changes, as we live, the uncontrolled vascular risk factors like insulin resistance and diabetes and high blood pressure, they all cause wear and tear damage into these arteries. And if we don't take care of these risk factors, they will continuously damage the endothelial cells. And over time, the blood-brain barrier will weaken and it becomes essentially, porous. And the studies that have shown us that there is accumulation of, say, for example, some microbes, some bacteria or some, fungal material or some heavy metals in the brain. It didn't happen because those heavy metals were, say, for example, or that bacterial or whatever microbes are seen in the brain. It was not that caused the Alzheimer's disease. It's basically, it could potentially be because of the porous blood-brain barrier that allowed for these compounds to deposit in the brain at the very end. So taking care of that incredible tight junction is important.
So you think that those very, very small blood vessels and the blood-brain barrier could be at the root of a lot of these neurodegenerative 100%. pathologies?
I'll give you an example. So we work in Loma Linda, less now, but we worked in Loma Linda, thousands of patients. The ones that were, and it's a particular type of population, right? It's Seventh-day Adventists. About a third of them are vegetarians. Majority of them are healthy living, very healthy. That's why they live 10 to 12 years longer and healthier than everybody else. I want people to just think about that. Not 12 days, not 12 weeks, not 12 months, 12 years healthier. Much less risk of cancer, much less risk of diabetes, and so on and so forth. In my clinic, where a third was supposed to be vegetarian, because a third of that population is vegetarian, out of 3,000 people, only 19 were vegetarian. Not 19%, 19. I know it's an observational data set, but it's still a massive observational data set. And we look at a lot of MRIs, lots. And clean, serene brains well into their 70s, 80s, and beyond. We worked in a free clinic or in a low-income clinic 1 day a week, and people would come for headache and so on and so forth, so we would do imaging. Every 40-year-old had microvascular disease in their brain. Now, that doesn't get recorded as in their charts because there's no charge associated with it. In the United States, there's ICD-10. There's no charge associated with microvascular disease of the brain, not minor, unless it becomes major. But almost every single patient had microvascular disease, where in this population, even their 60s and 70s, much less so.
And when you talk to neuroimaging scientists, by the time you actually see that white matter change, the damage to the capillaries, there's a whole cascade of inflammatory changes that have been going on for at least a decade. And we don't have the tools to detect small capillary damage.
Yeah, I was thinking it would be interesting to be able to run some test and say, hey, you're showing signs of early Alzheimer's. There's some blood-brain barrier potential damage happening here.
And we're getting there. And in fact, one of the neurosurgeons we were working with in Cedars, Dr. Gonzalez, looking at VEGF and other markers of vascular damage in the brain, we're there. And that's going to help the younger people, because if they know that they're having, and you can measure the change, I'm having this much damage now to the vasculature, and I've changed my life, now it's less. That's going to be an amazing marker. And we're there. There will be imaging tools. Right now, the imaging tools we have, the MRI we have, isn't sensitive enough to look at microvasculature in living beings. They've looked at postmortem, because postmortem you can even put people into the 7 Tesla machines and 11 Tesla machines, which are living person, you don't want to do that. But then once we get to the point where we can actually look at the microvascular disease early on, and then the person changes their lifestyle, then you can see, improvement. We're there. We're around the corner. A lot of people are jumping ahead of because they're claiming that they have it. They don't. And that's going to be exciting.
Right. And in the meantime, though, so people realize there are things that they can keep an eye on. It's looking at your LDL level or ApoB, HbA1c, fasting blood glucose, blood pressure. What's your cardiorespiratory fitness like? Are you doing that aerobic exercise? And some at a high intensity, a lot at moderate, doing strength training. All of these things are going to dramatically lower the risk of that damage to those micro.
Here's TikTok presentation for you. 5 things that's going to, no, I'm just kidding. 5 things that are good. So be your own, check a blood pressure every morning. When the cortisol jumps up, that's when people have most heart attack. So blood pressure. Be on top of your LDL. To be less than 70, Ayesha would push you less than 50. So that's another one. LDL. No, LDL. No. Hemoglobin A1C and insulin resistance. Watch that. Those are B12, not just normal, but higher normal. Omega-3, vitamin D. That's it. Those just by that. Don't smoke. Don't drink. Or if you're going to drink, like Ayesha, we hold a glass here and there and sip, but don't make it a part of your life. Don't buy into the French hypothesis that 1 wine a day is going to save you. None of that. But at least if you do these 7 or 8 things, you've significantly reduced your risk of cognitive decline. But more importantly, the brain is incredibly resilient. Do 2 more things to now build the brain. The 2 other things, exercise actually grows the brain. Study after study shows it grows hippocampus, it grows the frontal lobe, exercise intensively. And
it also improves vascular risk factor, factors like high LDL, like glucose metabolism is improved, blood pressure is fixed. I know
Mood,
that it doesn't sound
anxiety, depression, best treatments. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
We are going to wrap that up into a TikTok for sure, and maybe even a PDF of the top 10.
I know, too long for a TikTok, yeah. But the last one is build a life where you're pushing yourself intensely around your purpose or purposes. Mine is now I'm in a different phase of life where we're building this company around technology and AI and brain development and even identifying diseases. So that's a challenge. It's a thing that I've done MD, PhD. This is a different kind of animal altogether. It's complicated. Guitar, which I'll never get good at, but it's okay. And sports, so I'm pushing that. Find 3-4 purposes that really have meaning for you and push yourself to learn and be better at it day in and day out. These 8 things profoundly will create protection for your brain.
Kind of stack them on top of each other.
Stack them on top, yeah.
The other biomarker that a lot of people have asked me about, I did a story post and sort of got some community engagement before this episode, was homocysteine. Whether that is a biomarker that helps determine one's risk of neurodegenerative disease. Is that something that you would keep an eye on?
It's a very soft biomarker. It can be considered inflammatory. It can be considered a sign of B vitamins. It can be a sign of, although they've found studies where it's been correlated with outcome diseases, but I think it's a soft biomarker.
It's almost an intermediate marker.
Yes.
It's an intermediary of, say, for example, certain B vitamin deficiencies. It's an intermediary of lack of exercise and lack of physical activity, an intermediary of abnormal vascular risk factors resulting from high blood pressure and vascular damage or capillary damage. So, it's like that in-between person that could be as a result of so many different things. Yeah, it's important, but do we need to focus on that? No, we probably need to focus on things that are upstream that resulted in the homocysteine abnormality.
So I know that your perspective is we can do a lot with our lifestyle to lower our risk of Alzheimer's, dementia, but many of these neurodegenerative diseases, and you're not of the view that there's really a magic pill as such. But where do you see us getting to? Like, do you see in the next 5, 10, 15 years, if someone has mild cognitive impairment or they have Alzheimer's, I'm sure there's people listening right now who have family members that are going through this who are thinking, are we going to be able to do more than just slow the progression?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I'm big about not overstating the facts, but I'm incredibly optimistic. Whether it's Huntington's disease, it's one gene locus on chromosome 44, chromosome 4.
Which makes it easier in some ways.
Yeah, CRISPR, eliminate, and imagine.
Unpack CRISPR for some people that maybe at a high level, some people have not heard of that.
So it's actually different evolutions of CRISPR, but it's basically a genetic tool that actually cuts a part of the gene, and then you can insert another gene segment in front of that. And now we have gotten to a different generation of CRISPR where it's much more accurate, it's much cleaner, and we're going to get better and better at this, which means a lot of diseases. So it's not just a Huntington's disease, ApoE4. ApoE4 it's not like ApoE4 was not useful. It was a useful genetic byproduct of evolution. It was useful in a certain time of history where we're living from moment to moment, where our worry was not chronic inflammation because we saw a bad TV show, but to tiger. So in that realm, ApoE4 was useful. Or even sickle cell. Sickle cell was incredibly useful, and that's why it persisted, because it's protected against malaria. But now we're past that, and we can actually eliminate
some
genes.
of these genetic mutations that were protective in the short term work the opposite way when it comes to longevity.
It comes back to the same argument with paleo and all these people, which is evolution didn't care about you living past age 30. So please don't bring that up again. All it cared about was you living to 20 or 30 and getting a mate, reproducing, and then, in fact, dying. For you to bring up paleo science to me means that you don't know the purpose of evolution and what paleo means in that context. So most of what comes to us, a lot of what comes to us, most is an overgeneralization, is short-term survival value, but not long-term thriving value. That's the difference.
The other area I've seen CRISPR being spoken about, and I think there's a trial set up now, is for people with a particular gene mutation to PCSK9, which results in high LDL levels.
Yes.
And they're they're looking at. I think they've had some studies, preclinical studies, and now they're doing it in humans and seeing, does this CRISPR technology lead to lower LDL levels, and then does that have an effect on events, which we know based on a lot of research it will.
Yeah.
The other area that the near future, which is large data analysis and AI and machine learning, all this will bring to us, which is amazing. As you can see, I mean, from this talk, you can see we're saying that it's not just amyloid, but it's also amyloid. It's not just cholesterol, but it's definitely cholesterol. It's not just blood pressure, but it's definitely blood pressure, which means, and for every individual, that combination of things varies. For somebody, the cholesterol story is a lot more pertinent because of their ApoE status, because of their genetics, their liver, the cytochrome P450 of their liver, how it processes things, and all of this stuff. So we'll get to a point where we can do immediate genetic analysis of person and map it out as far as the complexity of how all of these work together when it comes to heart disease, cancer, brain diseases. And to us, it seems like extremely complicated, but no. When it comes to AI, when it comes to large data analysis and the tools for large data analysis, machine learning, that's going to be very simple. So within the next, I would say, 10 years, we can do that level of personalized analysis and programming for every single person.
Yeah, reason to be optimistic. Reason to try and stay alive for another 10 years to make the most of that.
Yes, yeah.
You mentioned Huntington's. We haven't spoken much about that at all in previous episodes. It's fairly rare. What do you know roughly what the incidence of that is?
About 1 in 100,000, if not less, and it's a devastating disease. Usually, it's when you see it in families, although it can happen spontaneously, as most genetics. But when it happens in families, when a father has it, then it's a dominant trait. So you can tell that a certain percentage of children will have it. And then you do genetic analysis, and that's pretty sad. When you know that the child has the gene, up to now, we can't do anything about it.
So is this a scenario where if your parent had it, it would be worth testing before you have kids?
100%, for multiple reasons. One is, I'm hoping that's going to change very soon, but up to now, if your parent had it, and if you have it, then do you want to bring children with that risk?
Yeah, they usually bring geneticists in the conversation right away for people to decide whether they want to bring offsprings into this world.
But that might change based on this gene therapy conversation, or it might make that decision, redundant.
It's going to be a moot point. Absolutely, it's going to be the most remarkable thing to see.
How does Huntington's affect someone?
The first signs are psychological. Depression, psychosis, behavioral disorders, things of that nature.
Have you seen someone with Huntington's?
Yes, several.
As a matter of fact, a lot of Huntington's patients, they tend to be misdiagnosed as psychiatric cases, and they end up being treated for psychosis and depression and other psychological problems for years, or at least a couple of years before they start having neurological dysfunctions, which is essentially movement disorders, inability to speak, either slowing of movements, or there's basically what would be called dystonia, which is abnormal movements of the arms and the legs, loss of speech, and it's just a devastating thing to see it kind of change so quickly.
And what's the average age where symptoms?
In the 30s.
Yeah.
In the
Early
30s, yes. Early. And then when you look at the MRI, it's almost every time when we see an MRI, we have to pull all the residents and students to come and see this.
It always becomes a journal club because it's rare.
So what does this one gene do?
So this one gene is coding this one code on CAG, cytosine, adenosine, and guanine, and it repeats. So if it repeats more than, usually it has a normal number of CAG repeats, but if it's abnormal, it has multiple repeats. So more than 37 or so is pathologic. And what it does is it creates this protein that then creates the cascade of degeneration. It starts damaging cells, it starts killing cells, and the brain looks like it's shrunken. By the time you see it, most of the time, because like Ayesha said at the beginning, they think it's psychiatric and so on and so forth. By the time it gets to the point of imaging, unless they knew it from the father's side, right, ahead of time, the brain is so shocking that you pull all the resonance. Like, look at this. This is a 30-something-year-old with a brain that looks like Swiss cheese, and it's devastating. And it's just that one locus.
Right. There are going to be people though who get Huntington's who do not have a parent that had it, right? You can still
Correct.
develop it.
Yes.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah.
So what happens in that circumstance? What explains Huntington's if someone hasn't inherited that gene?
A lot of genetic diseases actually, what happens is spontaneous generation of that genetic disorder. So they become the first or case zero of their lineage. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what's available to patients with Huntington's today?
Not much as far as prevention, no information about that. As far as patterns are concerned, the sporadic patterns, not much. We just know that specific percentage of populations develop them. If a parent has that, your chances go significantly higher. As a matter of fact, it's so mathematical that if a patient gets Huntington's disease at a specific age, they can actually tell at what age the child will get it, and that's it. Most of the treatment is focused on symptom management, so psychiatric medication, treating their anxiety, giving them physical and occupational therapy to prevent falls and things of that nature. It's pretty dismal.
The psychiatric component is the main thing.
Yeah.
And then the family. The family has to be involved at every phase of that.
Yes, there's a lot of support groups and psychologists involved to help the family and their supporters.
Fortunately, it's a lot rarer than Alzheimer's or
Correct.
Parkinson's. I mean, it's still, there is an individual there, so I don't want to minimize that. It's very sad. But like Parkinson's, for example, like 1 in 500.
No, it's less than that, but still, it's quite prevalent. And it's a little more on the men's side in Parkinson's. And Parkinson's is much more chronic. I did 2 years of fellowship in Parkinson's. It's a much longer lifespan, right? In Alzheimer's, it's usually about 10 to 15 years. Parkinson's, you see people in their 30 years or 40 years. Michael J. Fox, who had it in his 20s, at age 29, I think, and now he still has it. So it's a longer, more chronic disease.
What my understanding is, dopamine's kind of central to that.
Yeah. So by the time you see the first signs, and one of the first signs is what we call pill rolling tremor, which is not everybody has, but a great number of them have it. This pill rolling tremor, and then they have the bigger tremor. Usually one side is worse than the other, and then they get these little steps, what we call marche petit pas, which is small little steps, and freezing and all of these things.
It's almost as if somebody just turned down the dial, in their body. Everything gets slower. Their movement gets slower. Their facial expression becomes more numb. What we call mask faces. Basically, there's lack of expression on their face. Their voice goes down. So everything just kind of
their writing
slows
becomes
down.
smaller.
Yeah, and that's all because of lack of dopamine.
And by the time the first signs are detected, 80% of dopamine in substantia nigra, which is the main area where dopamine is created, 80% of those cells are dead. So there again, the key is to find out early enough so you can do something about it.
So most of the drugs are targeting dopamine production, synthesis.
Correct. Or blocking its breakdown. So one of two ways. You either create dopamine, you give dopamine, but not specifically dopamine. You give Sinemet, which is a combination that crosses the blood-brain barrier. So that if you give dopamine peripherally, it creates all kinds of havoc. So they created this thing where it crosses the blood-brain barrier, then dopamine is presented, and that's one way. The other way is you reduce the breakdown of dopamine, which is the COMT inhibitors and others, which then maintains enough dopamine in the system that it already has.
So why is it, to my understanding, it's not possible to cure Parkinson's, but if it was simply just a sort of lack of dopamine or deficiency of dopamine at a high level, on face value, I would have thought, well, replace the dopamine and everything, symptoms go away, a little bit like insulin for someone with type 2 diabetes, and their beta cells are no longer producing this hormone, so we'll exogenously replace it, and they can metabolize carbohydrates, get glucose where it needs to go, etc. What's different about
so I'll give you another fact about this, that dopamine, as much as we talk about it, it's a very small proportion of the neurotransmitters in the brain. But the reality is it's an incredibly powerful neurotransmitter. It has to do with movement, and it has to do with motivation, and so there's a lot of systems involved in dopamine. And once it starts dying, it just starts dying out backwards and kills a lot of dopamine producing cells with it. So you can definitely give it exogenously, but it's not just about giving dopamine. It's the tonic release of dopamine and how much you give dopamine. If you give too much dopamine, which actually all Parkinson's patients face this, we can't give dopamine in the right amounts, because we either give too much where they develop these dyskinesias, abnormal movements, or we give too little when they're freezing. And so what we do is now pumps. The newest thing is creating a pump to do it, and so we're experimenting with pumps. The other thing that was being done is, okay, so what does dopamine do? It goes to the basal ganglia and releases, and it's an incredible circuitry. It's literally circuitry. This comes on, this goes off, and as a result of on, off, you have movement. But then this other indirect system has to be turned off so that there's not excessive movement. It's electronics. So now they have these deep brain stimulators, these wires that go into the basal ganglia, and different parts can be turned on. And you have to see these videos, maybe you can share this, where the person is having so much movement and they can't control themselves, or they're completely frozen, and the person turns the dial, and all of a sudden the person is normal. It's one of the most fascinating things you've ever seen. Then you realize that we are mechanistic. It's remarkable. And because these wires go through areas that involve emotion, you can actually dial different parts of their emotions. So people that get too much dopamine, because you give them exogenously, they have a greater tendency to become addicted to gambling, to those kind of behaviors.
As a matter of fact, that's a question. When a Parkinson's disease patient comes to the clinic, we ask them, like, have you had any tendency to gamble? Have you been to any casinos? Do you watch, what's it called, the card games on things?
Poker.
It's that prevalent.
Yeah, so you can see that even human behavior is dialable. This is controversial. We're not going to go there, but I can go there. But so
what are you suggesting,
yes,
Dean?
we can turn dials on people, but nonetheless.
First, we have to hook them up to something.
That's right. But
That's
it's
the hard part.
incredibly interesting, though, that even human behaviors could be dialed. But in Parkinson's, in a way, you're right. If we get the dosage right, if we get it right in a way where it's released in the right places, right amount, which we haven't been able to, then we'll be able to maintain them longer, right? We can replace the dopamine producing cells by us creating the dopamine in the right ways. We might get there at some point. But the main thing is, how about finding out why these cells are dying? There's some relationship with toxins. There's some relationship with pesticides. There's some relationship with insulin resistance. All of these we're finding out.
What is the root cause of the cells that
What's the root
produce
cause?
dopamine?
Correct.
Why are they dying?
Exactly.
We don't know. So there are a lot of theories, and all of them need further research. Like, for example, there's enough data to show that people who are exposed to pesticides, not those who consume pesticides, because that's a whole another area.
Yeah, I know that. Don't open up that bag of worms.
I'm not going to.
Someone
I'm
who's
not going to
spraying
go
or
there. Right.
Yes,
Someone
yes.
actually
directly contact.
Exactly. They may be at a higher risk of having Parkinsonian features. As far as dietary elements are concerned, there is a compound called harmane. That was one of my research studies in Columbia University with a doctor who's a specialist. Harmane is actually produced when people barbecue meat. And it's a compound that is very closely related to advanced glycation end products. And harmane has been directly associated with essential tremor and Parkinsonian features.
Is it in the meat, or it's in the air and you're inhaling
it's in the
it
meat.
while you're cooking?
No, we consume it in the
Interesting.
barbecued meat. More in red meat, less in chicken, less in fish, less in vegetables.
So that's a hypothesis.
It's a hypothesis.
But
definitely
this hypothesis is
in
driven
red.
by some data.
Right. So
Yeah.
there's like multiple different studies that actually show that exposure to certain toxins and exposure to some nutritional factors can definitely result into that as well. So again, just like Alzheimer's disease is multifactorial, we don't have a definitive answer to that, but I think we will. At some point we will with
Yes.
big data analysis.
What do you think the future looks like for someone with Parkinson's in 10, 20 years? Will there be a lot more therapeutics that are available? And does someone with Parkinson's, do they typically live a sort of normal standard life expectancy?
Correct. They live much longer than people with Alzheimer's. I mean, with their disease, let's just put it that way. Their disease also starts earlier, but they live longer with their disease. And a lot of the mortality depends on things like falls and infections and things of that nature. So yes, I think that in the next 10 years, there's great hope for both treatment, early diagnosis, early intervention, and finding causality. I mean, I think much of the problem with causality finding is being able to study the large data that we have already and finding the correlations of things that had high signal, right? And why can't we do that? Because we need that kind of large model analysis that looks at all the variables and then says, oh, wait a second, this signal is sticking out. Let's go investigate it further. And with our new tools, I think we can do that.
We definitely have some data that shows that you can slow down the progression of Parkinson's disease by managing some risk factors very well. One of the things that we've been studying is insulin resistance and glucose metabolism management. That actually, if diabetes or pre-diabetes is managed better, the progression of Parkinson's disease is slowed down. Another one that is quite significant is exercise. As a matter of fact, there's a particular type of therapy for Parkinsonian patients called the big therapy, which basically they exaggerate their movements and they build muscle, and they tend to do very well as far as the progression of the disease is concerned.
Even drugs like GLP-1 agonists, which are for diabetes, there was incredibly positive data and positive relationship with delaying of Parkinsonian, and that needs to be further studied. Yes.
Fascinating. You mentioned before depression could affect cognition. And when I was doing a little bit of reading for this episode, I was interested. I came across a study, I think University of California is running on patients with Parkinson's who have depression. And they're looking at, I forget, I think it's psilocybin. It's a psychedelic compound. Yeah. This is a twofold question. One is depression really common among people with neurodegenerative diseases? And is that likely a contributing factor cause of, or is it more of a downstream effect of having a neurodegenerative condition, then they develop depression?
Yes.
Yes for both.
Yes for both. The answer is E. But for Parkinson's, it seems to be part of the mechanism as well. Meaning that we know that even before Parkinson's starts, a couple of things happen very commonly beforehand, as much as 10 to 15 to 20 years earlier. One is a much higher, now I want to make sure people who have restless leg syndrome, which is much higher, very high in the population, don't take this that, oh, I have that disease, or I will have Parkinson's. But people who have restless leg syndrome have a much higher risk of developing Parkinson's. Parkinsonian patients have GI disorders, much more so years earlier before the first symptoms of Parkinson's. And depression seems to be much more prevalent in Parkinson's, but almost mechanistically related to the disease, not as a, depression caused this or something, mechanistically related to the disease. So especially for Parkinson's, depression seems to be a very direct mechanistic contributor. For Alzheimer's and other diseases, it appears to be more as a consequence of. With Alzheimer's, anxiety is a major component. Anxiety, I think, is a ubiquitous component. And I treat anxiety and fear more than I treat the memory issues. Memory issues, well, we do a certain amount, but anxiety is a quality of life thing. And that seems to be ubiquitous.
That list of 10 things or so before that you mentioned.
Yes.
We could probably add mood to that. Some sort of check-in as to where your mood's at.
Yeah,
absolutely. Can you affect your mood? In a way you could. I mean, so the things I said were things that you could do something about. Or they themselves are the things that you do to bring about effect downstream. Can you affect your mood? In a way you can. I really am a big believer, not universally, but for the language that occupies your mind, if you make it a habit, not so much in a Pollyannish way, but in a very systematic, functional way. Find the positive language in your head. Find the positive reason for something. Find that is a big factor as far as stress management. We talk about this. There are three ways to manage stress: reduce, eliminate, and delegate the negative stressors. Increase, empower, and tool the positive stressors, which are the learning, musical instrument, learning, language, all of this stuff. And the things you have no control over, find the positive language around that. Because if you don't, that becomes overwhelming. Then forget about changing your diet. You're not going to. Forget about exercise. Is tough. If you don't have the motivation and you have negative language in your head, why would you go run or walk for an hour? So that language really matters.
I also want to say that there are a lot of cases of depression and anxiety and psychological and psychiatric problems that may not be influenced by any of this. So, for anyone listening to it, they should be aware that depression is a very complex disease. It's not something that's going to get fixed by just taking a walk outside or changing your language. Sometimes you can't change
Correct.
that language because you were born with it, or there were circumstances that just calcified and that becomes your identity. And so addressing mood disorders and psychological problems is a very important thing, and it needs to be done in the right way. And that may require a therapist, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, conversations, and being very open to nuance.
That's really helpful advice for when you're having a conversation with a friend as well. And, I think about, I was listening to another friend of mine's podcast, and he was talking about how you can support people around you with their mental health. And he kind of came up with this, I thought was really neat. It was, it can be uncomfortable to, particularly men to men, to ask someone how they're doing.
Yes.
And amongst his group, he's a surfer, and there's a word stoke is like a word that surfers use. And they came up with this thing, stoke factor. And they would kind of just message each other and check in, just, where's your stoke factor at?
Oh, wow, nice.
Kind of thing. But to your point, and this was something he was reiterating, is that often it can be better just to listen instead of trying to tell someone what they need to do, because this is so complicated.
It really is.
And you might think that your friend who's struggling, well, they should just go for a run or whatever, but it could run much deeper than that. And often just listening and then helping point them in the right direction to get professional support would be a sort of better avenue to follow.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I think that's crucial for people to know.
I want to finish here with a slightly different condition to anything that we've been discussing so far. I believe it's autoimmune in nature. Chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy. That's a mouthful.
Polyneuropathy,
Polyneuropathy, CIDP. This was another condition that received and has been receiving quite a bit of attention in the Australian media. There's a very well-known swimmer, Michael Klim, who I'm going to say he's probably in his early 40s. He's not old. Incredible swimmer. Like when I was growing up and we were watching the Olympics, he was part of the era with Ian Thorpe and Grant Hackett in Australia. They were winning golds all the time. I believe butterfly was his main stroke. He's sadly been diagnosed with CIDP, and I believe in doing a little bit of reading, the prognosis is not amazing. It can be a pretty sort of rapid development, loss of function. What is this condition, and is it similar or related at all to multiple sclerosis, which more people may have heard of?
Not so much to multiple sclerosis, more like to Guillain-Barré. I don't know if people know about Guillain-Barré. So Guillain-Barré is acute inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy. This is chronic inflammatory demyelinating. So, whereas in MS, the demyelination, which is this fatty sheet around axons in the brain, is central nervous system. In MS, it's the central nervous system that's being attacked. In these two diseases, the peripheral nervous system that's being attacked, autoimmune attack. Your body is creating antibodies against the myelin in the periphery. The different and AIDP or Guillain-Barré, it's more rapid. Within a few weeks, it starts with tingling in the fingers and then the toes. Toes and fingers, mostly in the toes, and then it rises. You lose your reflexes. You start having difficulty walking, you lose some sensation, and all of a sudden it goes up all the way to the head. And before we had these tools like respirators and things of that nature, people died. And CIDP is more chronic. If it's longer than 2 months, It's CIDP.
So, and the Guillain-Barré, that can be transient, and they can recover, or it can turn
It's usually
into
transient.
Okay.
You treat it, and people do well. What you do is, if it's rapid, if you catch it early enough, you bring them into the hospital. You give them IVIG, which is this antibodies that fools your own nervous system, your own immune system. So the immune system attacks those antibodies and not yourself. So they give enough time for the body to recover, and then usually people do better. Or what they do is plasmapheresis, where they draw your blood and clean it from these antibodies, and then they put it back. And I mean, it's a machine, it's continuous, and they do it 5 days in a row or so, and person does really well. Majority of people recover from Guillain-Barré. And with CIDP, it's a little more difficult. And with CIDP, it's more chronic. It's not as responsive to treatment. And they have the same symptomology: loss of sensation, loss of reflexes, this gait ataxia where the feet don't know where they're going, and weakness, and the weakness rises. Sometimes it stops. Sometimes actually it slows down. Sometimes it regresses, but a proportion actually goes on and becomes worse. It doesn't respond in the same way that you use the drugs for Guillain-Barré. It responds more to steroids and some other things that we use, more powerful drugs like methotrexate and steroids, and there are experimental drugs going on. But it has to do with an autoimmune disease against peripheral nerves.
Do we know what might trigger that?
We do. For example, for Guillain-Barré, it's so what it is mimicry. So what the body fools an external thing for itself. The antigens on them are similar. So usually it's and Guillain-Barré, it's a common one is Campylobacter jejuni, which is a bacteria in the stomach. So the body fixes on that, creates antibodies against that, which actually it's the same antibodies against the myelin cells. Or other bacterial and viruses like Epstein-Barr virus or other bacteria.
So these are things that people come in contact with in the environment,
Correct.
which then sets off this sort of attack against that, but at the same time it's attacking your own body.
Exactly.
There's usually a history of having some sort of a GI infection or a flu-like symptoms about 2 weeks before the onset of this reaction to the body in the acute inflammatory demyelinating form. And the chronic one, it's different.
It is.
There's not necessarily any external agent that induced it.
Not that we know of yet.
So far.
Yeah.
So that's why it's called chronic, because it's very slow and it's very, very progressive, and it doesn't really turn around the way acute form does.
Interesting. So listeners may be more familiar with type 1 diabetes, for example,
Yes.
with another autoimmune condition. In that case, the body is attacking its own beta cells in the
Yes.
pancreas, and then eventually that person can't produce insulin. Where does multiple sclerosis sort of come into this? Is that another autoimmune condition?
Yes, it's a
Definitely.
very interesting one. It has some really unique features. So MS is a disorder that affects women more. It affects certain populations. If you have traveled past a certain latitude before the age of 15, age 15, your risk becomes much less. If you've traveled after that, your risk is higher. People from the Nordic areas are much higher risk, but if they come to the United States, let's say before the age of 15, the risk is lower. So there seems to be a temporal, geographic, infectious autoimmune. Do you see the multiple
The changing of the environment, it's not the getting on the plane.
No. I don't know.
At the beginning of that, I was thinking...
Yeah. But to be honest, we don't. But it's most likely the fact that you have certain genetic proclivities because you're from certain areas of the world. And you remember that. And when you travel from one place to another place before a certain age, because the myelin is developing in that before that age, probably rapidly, certain infections that are in the new area are making you more susceptible. Now, this is way extrapolation, so I want the audience to know I'm playing around now with theories. We don't know clearly, but we know these relationships. Again, large data analysis will give us much better picture, but we know these relationships.
It has to do Potentially, it has to do with exposure to Epstein-Barr virus during childhood. It has to do probably with, sun exposure and vitamin D production in the body. And the theory is that people who are living in the northern hemisphere are not exposed to vitamin D or sunlight, and that's why they have increased risk. And if they travel from a northern area to, say, for example, a tropical area before the age of 15, their risks fall significantly. Vice versa, if somebody lives in the tropical sunny area, if they travel to a northern area, they've done some migration studies. They've looked at immigrants who were from a tropical area and they started living in northern areas. The parents were fine, but then their children had a higher risk of developing multiple sclerosis.
And add on top of that, there's a genetic component as well. So the genetic is not absolute in this case. There seems to be a genetic proclivity, infection, vitamin D, environment. So you can see that it's still multi-dimensional, but it's kind of very interesting.
Super interesting.
For a while, they thought that it was related to what do they call it? To a virus from a dog, because when they looked at this population in an island off of England, this population had a much higher risk of developing MS. And the only difference was in this population, there were certain dogs. So they thought that was related to this virus thing. But it wasn't. It was just the population's risk factors.
But at its core, it's an autoimmune condition where there are specific antigens that, the antibodies actually start damaging the myelin, or the fatty layer that is a supporting structure, that's an insulation that helps the messaging system. So a nerve communicates with another nerve through these axons, and these myelins essentially make that communication go faster. And when the myelin is damaged, it doesn't go faster. It slows down. And so it actually causes trouble with movement, with sensation, with coordination, with vision. And it happens in younger individuals. And it's very interesting because sometimes these symptoms of, say, for example, I have numbness in one hand, or my foot, I have a foot drop. I have a friend who has MS, and the first signs of her symptoms was she couldn't, when she was walking in the hallway in the hospital with us, she would drag her foot and we would all laugh like, what are you doing? So it could just be a foot drop. And these things actually get ignored because they get better over time. There's almost like a remission where they get better over time, and people tend to ignore them. But now we know that with imaging and with biomarkers from the cerebrospinal fluid, one can actually very sensitively detect multiple sclerosis.
The most common sign, first sign and symptom is the first common is optic neuritis, where they have difficulty with vision. And when you look at the eye, there's macular swelling, and there is inflammation, and it's related to this autoimmune process that starts in the optic nerve.
I read an interesting review on MS and nutrition, and it seems a lot of it's very preliminary, but there were some interesting findings there suggesting that polyunsaturated fats and fiber may be helpful in managing symptoms. And they emphasize that certainly not enough data to suggest that they could replace medications, at least in most scenarios, but enough there to hopefully inspire some future nutrition intervention trials.
Right, yeah. Overall, I think the data shows that...
Did you see how we looked at each other there?
No.
So I'll tell you, our 19th anniversary was 29th of April. So we've 19 years, actually a year before that we were.
Congratulations.
This is conversations we've had for 20 years. There are areas that it makes us a little uncomfortable. And this is one of them. And I hope we were wrong. I love it when we're wrong about this. But I think when it comes to MS, the nutrition world is like jumping way too far.
Right, yes.
There is that the mechanism is not conducive for that kind of inflammation, but the data is not that strong. So we just did another podcast. We looked at the data pretty closely. There isn't good data. There isn't really good data.
Yeah,
we hope we're wrong.
I think we made a reel on our Instagram, and we got so many questions, and a lot of people were very upset too, because there have been groups and movements in the nutrition world, namely Roy Swank. That was a doctor who basically created a dietary pattern for MS patients. And then we have the Walls Protocol. Terry Walls is an internal medicine specialist somewhere in I think Iowa, and she has had the Walls protocol. She has MS, and it was basically a paleo kind of a diet. And then exactly. And then Dr. McDougall did another trial to look at low-fat, whole food plant-based diet and its effect on MS. And in all of these dietary patterns, you tend to see that people quote unquote feel better, which means that they are able to do their activities better, but it never modified the disease process. There's no objective evidence of these kind of dietary patterns getting rid of these white matter lesions that we see in multiple sclerosis. There's no impact on the rate of remission of the disease. They just felt better. And then there were some studies that looked at Mediterranean diet and multiple sclerosis. So generally speaking, the theme is if you eat a diet that consists of fiber, polyunsaturated fats instead of saturated fats, complex carbohydrates instead of refined carbohydrates, and more focus on an anti-inflammatory component of the diet, people actually tend to do better. But we can't say that it reverses the disease or modifies the disease in any way.
Right. That's the important nuance and context, the reason that you're sitting here to add that.
And the reason so the question is, why are you saying this? I mean, plants are good, or eating healthy is good, it's going to help, yes. But extrapolating outcome statements are consequential, because then if we make statements that are not really driven by strong data, we weaken our conversations, we weaken our science, we weaken our whatever else we say. Not we, all of us. So that's why it's important.
And we stop potentially exploring as deeply, and potentially if someone sort of overestimates how impactful nutrition is, say for example in this, they could be inclined to turn something else down.
Agreed. And sorry to cut you off, but in MS we actually do have disease modifying medication. We actually have good medications that can lower the rate of, or increase remission, or actually reduce the impact of multiple sclerosis on outcome, right? And so a lot of people, if we put too much emphasis on diet, they might actually turn down some medications that could potentially help them. Yeah. And you know how it is, like with this whole notion of drugs being bad and lifestyle being good. I think it's finding a balance between the two.
And we'd never say that eating healthy is not going to help everything. But for example, in the realm of nutritional psychiatry,
oh goodness, there's so much.
That's another 2 hours.
Seems
so
like
many wrong things going on
the
there.
cart is a long way ahead of the horse there.
Oh, way
Absolutely.
ahead. Yes.
Yeah.
And the danger there is people hear this and they say, oh, I'm not going to take my antipsychotic medication. I'm going to just eat more broccoli, which we love broccoli, but it's not going to stop your psychosis.
Yeah, we could dedicate another episode to that. I haven't told you, I'm involved in a prospective cohort study. This is work done by Megan Lee at Bond University in Australia. And we're trying to get a better feel for dietary patterns and depression, because this is another one where there's been a lot of headlines and a lot of talk on social media, but the data is mostly cross-sectional. There's no temporal element. It's not robust data at all. So we're looking to go into initially with a data set that is going to allow us to look at the temporal nature, and then Megan's hope is to set up a prospective cohort study.
Oh,
that would be amazing, because if you have so in everything, it's your measurement tool, large of your the sample size, and your methodology. If you can control those three things, at the minimum, you're going to get better data. You're going to get more delineatable. I mean, that's the key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm so excited that's happening. Good.
I think maybe we should land the plane.
I think so.
And it's been a real pleasure having you both back on. And as I said at the start, just happy to be back in your presence. Looking forward to dinner in a few nights' time.
Yes.
And maybe going for a bike ride as well.
We're looking forward to that. Absolutely.
We appreciate you. The podcast, The Proof. I mean, it's okay if I speak for both of us,
Of
right?
course.
I mean, we're just such big fans of the podcast, especially because you bring nuance, you bring different kind of conversations, and I think one of the most important things we can do and we should be doing is stay away from absolutes and bring more nuance and complexity to our conversations. So we thank you for bringing that into the Proof podcast.
Thank you. And if
What she said.
folks, I know you've been on this show like a bazillion times, so everyone's familiar with you, but should they not be, firstly, go back and listen to all those episodes. I think omega-3s came up in this episode. We did a 2-hour conversation just on that, and there's probably another 5 more stemming back to the original ones we did at your place. So if someone is wanting to connect with you, though, where can we send them?
Sure. We are the Brain Docs on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, now TikTok. And our website is thebraindocs.com. We actually have a really good newsletter where we collect the latest information, evidence-based information on brain health, and send it out to our audience. And it includes the podcast. We have a podcast too. It's called The Brain Health Revolution. And so, there's multiple ways that people can stay in touch with us, and we love communicating with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really enjoyed your deep dive into the amyloid controversy on the podcast, so people can go and listen to that for a bit more information.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.